On the birthday of my father, he looked at the vibrant finger painting my 6-year-old autistic son made for him, called it cheap, embarrassing trash, and tossed it directly into the fireplace ashes. I swallowed my pride, dug the soot-covered canvas out with my bare hands, took my son, and walked away. 9 years later, that exact painting sold at auction for over $7 million. My father called me, demanding the money was his, until the true buyer stepped forward and the entire exhibition fell dead silent. My name is Whitney, and I am 34 years old. 9 years ago, I was a 25-year-old single mother standing in the foyer of the sprawling Connecticut estate of my parents, praying for a scrap of compassion that did not exist. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your heart broken by the people who were supposed to protect you. Growing up in our affluent Connecticut neighborhood, the rules were unspoken but absolute. Perfection was expected. Success was mandatory. Anything less was a liability. My father, Donovan, was a ruthless real estate developer who valued people only by their net worth or what they could do for his public image. My mother, Joanne, was his perfect counterpart, curating our lives like museum exhibits. When I became a single mother at 19, I broke the ultimate rule. I ruined the perfect family picture. But when my son Leo was diagnosed with severe nonverbal autism a few years later, my parents did not offer support. They offered shame. They treated Leo like a dirty secret they had to hide from their country club friends. I remember the drive to the estate that evening. My unreliable car sputtered along the winding roads of the wealthy neighborhood. I had spent hours trying to make Leo comfortable in his formal clothes. I practiced my speech to my father dozens of times in the mirror. I told myself that underneath his harsh exterior he was still a grandfather. I convinced myself that if he just saw how hard Leo worked on the painting, his heart would soften. I was so incredibly naive. That night, the house was packed for the 60th birthday gala of my father. The foyer was a sea of tailored suits, expensive gowns, and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. The air smelled of expensive catering and heavy perfume. I stood near the entrance, holding Leo tightly by the hand. He was 6 years old, wearing a little bow tie that he hated constantly pulling at the stiff fabric. In my other hand, I held a canvas. It was a painting Leo had worked on for 3 weeks. For a child who could not speak a single word, colors were his voice. He had pressed his small fingers into the canvas, layering bright, vibrant blues and intense, fiery oranges in a chaotic but mesmerizing pattern. It was his masterpiece. It was his way of saying happy birthday to a grandfather who barely acknowledged his existence. I had framed it myself using the last $20 in my checking account to buy a simple black border. I was terrified to approach my father. My stomach churned with anxiety, but I was also desperate. The developmental pediatrician we saw had strongly recommended an intensive specialized speech therapy program for Leo. The therapy cost $500 a month. Working as a receptionist at a clinical therapy center, I was barely making rent for our cramped, noisy studio apartment. I skipped meals just to buy Leo the high-quality art supplies he needed to communicate. $500 might as well have been $1 million. I had no other options left. I had to ask for a loan. I waited until there was a slight lull in the crowd around him. My father stood near the massive stone fireplace in the grand living room, holding a glass of scotch, holding court as he always did. My older brother Cameron stood right beside him, wearing a smug smile and a suit that cost more than my car. Cameron was the golden child. He had coasted through a private university on the dime of our father and had just been handed a lucrative corporate job at the real estate firm, despite having no real qualifications other than his last name. I took a deep breath, squeezed the hand of Leo for courage, and walked over. The conversation stopped as we approached. Several wealthy investors turned to look at us, their eyes sweeping over my plain dress and the fidgeting hands of my son. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Leo made you something. He worked really hard on it." I held out the framed canvas. Leo shrank behind my legs, overwhelmed by the bright lights and the staring faces. My father did not reach for the painting immediately. He stared at it, then stared at me, his expression hardening into a mask of pure disdain. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent room. "It is a finger painting," I explained, my face growing hot. "He loves colors. It is his gift to you." My father took the frame with two fingers, holding it away from himself as if it were contaminated. He looked at the swirling blues and oranges, and his lip curled upward in a sneer. "And while I am here," I continued, my voice dropping to a whisper so the guests would not hear. "Dad, I need a favor. Just a small loan. $500 for a new speech therapy program for Leo. I promise I will pay you back every single cent. I just need a little help to get him started." The silence that followed was suffocating. My father looked from the painting to my face, and then he let out a short, harsh laugh. "You come to my home in front of my colleagues and investors, hand me this piece of cheap, embarrassing trash, and then have the audacity to beg for money." He did not whisper. He projected his voice so every single person in the living room could hear him. I felt the blood drain from my face. Guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one looked away. They were watching a public execution. "Dad, please," I begged, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. "It is for his therapy. He needs it to learn how to communicate." The face of my father turned red with anger. "I am not funding your mistakes, Whitney. You chose to ruin your life. You chose to have a defective child. I am not pouring my hard-earned money into a bottomless pit just because you refuse to face reality." Next to him, Cameron let out a loud snort of laughter. "Oh, come on, Whitney," Cameron mocked, taking a sip of his drink. "Stop bringing the family down. You are embarrassing Dad in front of the board members. Look at that painting. It looks like a dog threw up on a canvas." Before I could even process the cruel words of my brother, my father moved. He did not hand the painting back to me. He did not set it on the mantel. He turned smoothly on his heel and tossed the framed canvas directly into the massive stone fireplace behind him. The fire was not lit, but the grate was piled high with thick black soot and dirty gray ashes from the night before. The frame hit the iron grate with a loud crack, shattering the glass. The canvas tumbled downward, landing face first in the filthy debris. I gasped, a physical pain shooting through my chest. Leo let out a distressed, high-pitched keen, pulling at his ears, overwhelmed by the sudden noise and the hostility in the room. "You want to know where my money goes?" my father demanded, stepping toward me and pointing a rigid finger toward the large bay windows facing the driveway. "Look out there." I followed his finger, my vision blurred with tears. Parked under the exterior lights of the circular driveway was a brand-new gleaming silver sports car. It was easily a $90,000 vehicle. "I bought that for Cameron today," my father announced proudly. "Because Cameron earned it. He secured his position. He makes this family look good. I reward success, Whitney. I do not reward failure, and I certainly do not fund garbage." The cruelty of the moment paralyzed me. He had just spent nearly $100,000 on a luxury toy for his spoiled son, but refused to lend me a fraction of that amount for medical care. And he had destroyed the only thing my son had to offer him. I did not argue. I did not scream. I did not try to defend myself to the crowd of silent, staring guests. I dropped to my knees right there in my best dress. I crawled onto the stone hearth, reaching my bare hands directly into the filthy soot and ash. The shattered glass cut into my palm, but I did not care. I dug my fingers into the dirt and pulled the painting out of the fireplace. The beautiful blues and oranges were covered in thick black streaks of soot. The glass was ruined. The frame splintered, but the canvas itself was intact. I clutched it to my chest, ruining the front of my dress with ash. I stood up, my hands shaking, blood mixing with the dark soot on my fingers. I looked at my father, who was watching me with an expression of absolute disgust. I looked at Cameron, who was still smirking into his glass. And I looked at my mother, Joanne, who had just walked into the room, assessed the situation, and rolled her eyes in annoyance. I took the hand of Leo. He was trembling, hiding his face against my leg. I did not say a single word to any of them. I turned my back on the glittering chandeliers, the expensive catering, and the people who were supposed to be my family. I walked out the heavy oak front doors into the cold night air, leaving a trail of ash on their pristine marble floors. I did not know how I was going to survive, or how I was going to pay for the therapy, but as I clutched that ruined painting in my bleeding hands, I made a silent promise to myself and to my son. They would never be allowed to make us feel worthless again. The bitter winter wind whipped aggressively across the long, circular driveway as I finally reached my rusted sedan. My entire body trembled violently, though I could not tell if it was from the freezing Connecticut air or the sheer adrenaline of the humiliation I had just endured. My hands were completely numb. They were coated in a thick, greasy layer of black fireplace ash and fresh bright red blood from where the shattered glass had sliced into my palms. I ignored the stinging pain. I opened the rear door of the car and strapped Leo into his faded booster seat. My sweet, innocent son was rocking back and forth with intense, frantic energy. He was humming a low, continuous, repetitive tone deep in his throat. It was his way of trying to soothe his own nervous system after the overwhelming sensory assault of the bright lights, the loud voices, and the sudden explosive hostility we had just escaped. I pulled my thin wool coat off my own shoulders and draped it carefully over his small, shivering body. I walked around to the back of the car and popped the trunk. I placed the ruined, soot-covered canvas gently onto a pile of old blankets. The beautiful, chaotic mix of vivid blues and fiery oranges was now smeared with dirty gray ash. The wooden frame splintered and broken. My father had thrown it away like a piece of diseased garbage. I slammed the trunk shut, walked around to the driver's seat and climbed inside the freezing cabin. I inserted the key into the ignition and turned it forward. The engine sputtered weakly, choked, and died instantly. Panic seized my chest. I twisted the key again. Nothing happened. Only a hollow, metallic clicking sound echoed from under the hood. I hit the steering wheel hard with my ash-stained hands, leaving dark smudges on the gray plastic. We were completely trapped. My rent was due in exactly 48 hours. My bank account was currently overdrawn by $12. I had exactly one $20 bill in my purse. And now, my only mode of transportation was dead in the driveway of a father who despised my very existence. Suddenly, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion swung wide open. The bright, warm yellow light from the grand foyer spilled out onto the dark pavement. My mother Joanne marched down the stone steps with furious determination. My father Donovan followed closely behind her, his posture rigid and authoritative. The freezing night air did not seem to bother them at all, protected as they were by layers of expensive cashmere and tailored wool. Joanne marched straight up to my car window and tapped aggressively on the glass with her diamond ring. The sound was sharp and commanding. I reluctantly rolled the window down. The freezing wind rushed into the cabin, biting at my exposed skin. Joanne did not ask if my car was broken down. She did not lean in to check if her autistic grandson was warm enough. She simply glared at my ruined dress and hissed at me with pure venom. "You just had to ruin the entire party, did you not?" Joanne spat the words at my face. "You could not simply attend a celebration and behave normally for one single night. You had to make a spectacular, dramatic scene in front of the biggest, most important investors your father has ever courted. Look at yourself. You tracked dirty ash all over my imported Persian rugs. Do you have any idea how much those cost to clean?" I stared up at the woman who had given birth to me. My brain struggled to comprehend her priorities. My son made a beautiful gift for his grandfather. I said, my voice trembling with a potent mixture of the freezing cold and an absolute blinding rage. And my father threw it into the fireplace ashes like it was garbage. How can you possibly defend that action? How can you stand there and worry about the cleaning bill for a rug when your husband just willfully crushed the spirit of a 6-year-old boy? Joanne scoffed loudly, crossing her arms tightly over her expensive shawl. "Oh, please," she sneered. "Do not try to play the innocent victim here, Whitney. You ruined your own life a long time ago. Being a single mother was your own stupid mistake. You chose to keep a child you clearly could not afford, and now you expect us to constantly clean up your financial messes." You bring that boy here tonight knowing full well he cannot behave normally in a social setting, and you use him as a prop to beg your father for money. It is pathetic, and it is entirely your own fault. Before I could formulate a response to her cruelty, Donovan stepped forward, pushing Joanne slightly aside so he could look directly into the car. He looked at the dashboard lights. He looked at my dead engine. He looked at my desperate, tear-stained face. He knew exactly what was happening. He was a ruthless businessman who built an empire on exploiting the weaknesses of other people. He could smell the desperation on me from a mile away. He knew I had absolutely zero options left. Your car is completely dead, he stated flatly, his voice devoid of any emotion. And if I know your terrible financial habits, you probably do not have the rent money covered for that tiny, miserable dump you live in. You are exactly one step away from dragging my pristine reputation through the mud by ending up in a homeless shelter. I will not tolerate that. I will not have the members of the local country club gossiping about my destitute daughter living on the streets. He reached into the inner pocket of his perfectly tailored suit jacket. He did not pull out his checkbook to help me. He pulled out a thick folded legal document and a sleek silver luxury pen. I am going to make you a one-time offer tonight. Whitney Donovan declared, his eyes cold and calculating. I will pay your rent for exactly 1 month. I will hand you a check for $1,500 right now so you can hire a tow truck and keep a temporary roof over the head of your son, but you are going to earn every single penny of it. I stared blankly at the folded paper in his hand. What is that document? I asked, my voice dropping to a frightened whisper. It is a formal severance of support, Donovan explained smoothly. He unfolded the document and pressed it flat against the cold metal roof of my dead car. My corporate lawyers drew it up several months ago. I have just been waiting for the right moment to present it to you. It is a legally binding contract. By signing this paper tonight, you permanently waive any and all future claims to my estate, my business assets, and my personal wealth. You agree in writing that I owe you absolutely nothing. There will be no inheritance. There will be no emergency bailouts. There will be no child support or charity for your life choices. You will officially and legally cease to be my financial responsibility. I felt physically sick to my stomach. My own father had actually paid a high-priced corporate lawyer to draft a legal document specifically to disown me. He had been planning this betrayal for months. He had simply been waiting for a moment when I was weak enough, poor enough, and desperate enough to sign it without fighting back. But Donovan was not finished. He clicked his silver pen. He leaned over the hood of my car and began writing a brand new sentence by hand at the very bottom of the printed page. He wanted to make absolutely sure there were no legal loopholes. He wanted to make sure his incredible cruelty was permanently documented in ink. I watched his hand move across the paper with swift, deliberate strokes. Read it out loud, he commanded, sliding the paper across the roof toward me. I stepped out of the car. The freezing winter wind bit aggressively through my thin, ash-stained dress. I looked down at the fresh, dark ink on the white paper. It read, clearly, I, Donovan, claim no ownership, responsibility, or association with Whitney or any of her defective child's property or assets. Defective. That single word hit my chest like a physical, violent blow. He did not just disown me. He legally and permanently labeled my innocent, brilliant, struggling son as defective. He wanted to ensure that absolutely nothing Leo ever touched, created, or owned would ever be associated with his pristine, wealthy legacy. He wanted to be completely legally severed from us forever. I looked at the silver pen resting in his hand. Then I looked through the car window. Leo was shivering in his booster seat. His small hands were covering his ears tightly, his eyes wide with anxiety and confusion. We had no money for food. The car was dead. The temperature was dropping below freezing. If I did not sign this horrific paper, we would be sleeping in a freezing car tonight, and we would face certain eviction by Monday morning. I had to protect my son. I had to secure a warm roof over his head, even if it meant signing a document that stripped away every last ounce of my pride and dignity. I snatched the silver pen roughly from the hand of my father. My hands were still shaking violently, Fresh blood from the broken glass on my palms stained the pristine white paper as I pressed my hand against it to steady myself. I signed my name on the dotted line. I did not hesitate. I did not cry. My tears had completely dried up, replaced instantly by a cold, hard, unbreakable resolve that would end up fueling me for the rest of my natural life. Donovan snatched the paper back immediately. He checked the signature meticulously to ensure it was legible and legally binding. Satisfied that he had won, he pulled a pre-written check from his pocket and flicked it casually toward my face. It fluttered through the freezing air and landed in a dirty puddle on the wet pavement at my feet. He did not even have the basic human decency to hand the money directly to me. "Consider this the absolute last transaction between us," Donovan said, his voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth or regret. "Do not ever call us again. Do not ever show up at this house again. You are permanently on your own." Joanne did not say a single word. She simply turned around and walked back up the long driveway, wrapping her expensive shawl tighter around her shoulders to ward off the cold. She did not say goodbye. She did not look back at me or her grandson even once. Donovan followed her closely, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind them, leaving me standing entirely alone in the freezing, silent dark. I bent down and picked up the damp check from the wet pavement. $1,500. That was the exact price of my family ties. I got back into the cold car and locked the doors. I picked up my cell phone and used the very last 2% of my battery life to call a 24-hour towing service. I sat in the freezing darkness with my son pulling him into my lap and wrapping my coat securely around his shivering shoulders. I held him close, burying my face in his hair. I looked toward the trunk of the car where the ruined ash-covered painting lay hidden in the dark. My father had explicitly and legally disclaimed any ownership of the property of my son. He had legally stated in an ironclad contract that the painting and anything else Leo ever created belonged entirely and exclusively to us. My father thought he was executing a brilliant legal maneuver to protect his wealth from a financial burden. He had absolutely no idea that in his arrogant cruelty, he had just signed away his rights to the most valuable asset he would ever hold in his hands. The tow truck headlights pierced the freezing darkness, marking the absolute end of my former life. Within 48 hours of cashing that humiliating check, I secured a cramped, drafty studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The space was barely larger than the walk-in closet I had growing up. The radiator hissed constantly, and the single window looked out over a brick alleyway that smelled of damp cardboard and exhaust fumes. But it was ours. The lock on the door belonged to me, and my father could never walk through it. Survival became my only religion. I secured a daytime position as a medical receptionist at a busy pediatric therapy clinic. The pay was minimum wage, but it kept me adjacent to the medical resources Leo desperately needed. When my shift ended at 5, I picked Leo up from a subsidized city daycare program that he hated. We would eat a rushed dinner of boxed macaroni or peanut butter sandwiches in our tiny kitchen. Then at 8 o'clock, my second shift began. I dragged a heavy mop bucket through the empty, echoing halls of a corporate accounting firm until 2 in the morning. I wiped down mahogany desks and emptied trash cans for executives who made more in an hour than I made in a month. My back constantly ached. My hands were perpetually raw and cracked from industrial bleach. I slept perhaps 3 hours a night on a thin mattress on the floor next to the cot of my son. The physical exhaustion was agonizing, but the psychological warfare waged by my family was worse. Cameron refused to let me fade away in peace. He had always fed on my failures, and my exile was his ultimate feast. Every few days, my cheap prepaid phone would buzz with a new text message. A photo of him posing on the deck of a yacht in Monaco. A picture of a $5,000 steak dinner. A video of him revving the engine of the sports car my father had bought him. His messages were always laced with venomous pity. "Enjoying the real world, Whitney. Just bought a new Rolex today. Dad says hello. Hope living in a slum is worth your pride." I never replied. I simply deleted the messages and went back to scrubbing floors. I used his cruelty as fuel. Every taunt pushed me to scrub harder, to stay awake longer, to fight more fiercely for the future of my son. The turning point came on a rainy Sunday afternoon, exactly 4 months after the birthday party. I was using my only day off to deep clean our tiny apartment. Leo was sitting quietly in the corner, lining up his colored blocks in a perfectly straight, unbroken row. I opened the small closet to reorganize our few winter coats and saw the canvas tucked away in the back. I had wrapped it in a plastic garbage bag the night we left the estate, hiding it away, because the sight of the soot-covered frame made my chest physically ache. I pulled the bag out and gently laid the painting on our scratched linoleum floor. The wooden frame was completely shattered, splintered beyond repair by the force of my father throwing it against the iron grate. I carefully pried the canvas loose from the broken wood and set it on the kitchen table. The thick, greasy fireplace ash still coated the surface, obscuring the bright colors Leo had worked so hard to blend. I wet a soft microfiber cloth with warm water and gently began to wipe the soot away. I moved slowly, terrified of ruining the paint beneath. As the gray ash dissolved and transferred to my rag, the true image began to emerge. I stopped wiping. I froze the damp cloth hovering in the air. I leaned over the table, my breath catching in my throat. For 3 weeks before the party, I had watched Leo smear paint onto this canvas. I had assumed it was just the chaotic, sensory-driven play of a severely autistic child. I thought he was just mixing colors randomly to self-soothe. But sitting there under the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of my cheap apartment, with the ash completely cleared away, I saw the truth. It was not chaos. It was absolute mind-bending precision. The fiery oranges and deep, vibrant blues were not just smeared together. They were organized into a complex, perfectly symmetrical geometric pattern. The swirls followed a strict repeating mathematical sequence. Every single stroke mirrored a corresponding stroke on the opposite side of the canvas, with flawless millimeter-perfect accuracy. Hidden within the vibrant layers of paint was a structural depth that felt almost architectural. It was as if Leo had mapped out a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. The emotional intensity of the color palette was staggering, conveying a sense of trapped, frantic energy seeking order. It was not the messy finger painting of a disabled 6-year-old. It was a calculated, breathtaking masterpiece. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I looked over at Leo. He was still sitting on the floor now, arranging his red blocks into a complex spiral pattern on the rug. I realized in that moment that my son was not just trying to communicate. He was speaking a visual language that was light years beyond my comprehension. My father had looked at this canvas and seen garbage. I looked at it and saw absolute, undeniable genius. I knew I had to act immediately. Working as a receptionist at the pediatric clinic gave me access to the schedules of some of the best developmental specialists in the state. For weeks, I had been trying to get Leo off the wait list for Dr. Aris, a renowned pediatric neurologist who specialized in rare cognitive profiles. His wait list was normally 8 months long. The next morning, I noticed a sudden cancellation on his schedule for that very afternoon. I did not ask for permission. I clocked out on my lunch break, ran to the daycare to pick up Leo, grabbed the cleaned canvas from our apartment, and marched directly into the office of Dr. Aris. The doctor was a quiet, observant man with silver hair and a gentle demeanor. He did not object to my impromptu arrival. He simply invited us into his consultation room and observed Leo, who immediately walked over to a stack of magazines and began sorting them by exact dimensional size rather than title or color. I placed the canvas on the desk of the doctor. I explained how Leo had painted it without any guides, rulers, or prior artistic training. I explained the absolute silence of my son, his intense sensory aversions, and the way he interacted with the physical world around him. Dr. Aris put on his glasses and leaned over the painting. He studied the geometric swirls, the color blending, and the flawless symmetry for a very long time. The silence in the clinic room stretched out thick with anticipation. When the doctor finally looked up, his eyes were wide with genuine awe. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Aris said, his voice hushed with reverence. "Whitney, the spatial awareness required to execute a pattern this complex without the use of drafting tools is statistically staggering. The way he has utilized the Fibonacci sequence in these corner spirals is something most trained adult artists struggle to conceptualize, let alone execute by hand." He turned his chair toward me, folding his hands on his desk. "Your son has autism spectrum disorder, which you already know. But he also presents with a profoundly rare condition known as savant syndrome. His neurodivergence has essentially rewired his brain to process the world through extreme high-level systemic logic and visual mathematics. His artistic genius is absolute and undeniable. He is not locked inside his mind, Whitney. He is operating on an intellectual and artistic frequency that is simply entirely different from ours." Tears of validation spilled over my eyelashes and tracked down my cheeks. For 6 years, I had been told my son was broken. My parents had called him defective. Society had labeled him a burden. Now, one of the top medical professionals in the country was confirming what my mother's intuition had always known. My son was brilliant. However, Dr. Aris continued, his expression turning grave and serious. "A mind this extraordinary requires incredibly specific cultivation. If Leo does not receive the proper specialized care, sensory therapies, and advanced educational environment to channel this gift, his frustration will eventually consume him. The traditional public school system will completely crush his spirit. He needs an environment that caters explicitly to gifted neurodivergent children." "What do I do?" I asked, leaning forward urgently. "Tell me where to take him. I will do whatever it takes." Dr. Aris pulled a notepad toward himself and wrote down a single name: the Vanguard Art Academy. It is an elite, highly specialized institution in Manhattan for gifted youth. They have the sensory facilities, the therapists, and the artistic mentors he needs to survive and thrive. It is the only place in the country equipped to handle a savant profile like his. He slid the paper across the desk to me. I looked at the prestigious name written in ink. Then I asked the question that always determined the boundaries of my life. How much does it cost? Dr. Aris hesitated, a look of deep sympathy crossing his features. "The tuition combined with the specialized one-on-one behavioral support he will require is approximately $85,000 a year." The air was sucked entirely out of the room. $85,000. I was making minimum wage. I was scrubbing toilets at midnight just to afford peanut butter and electricity. I was currently avoiding calls from the electric company because I was 3 weeks behind on my bill. The cost was astronomical. It was a massive, impenetrable wall of wealth standing between my son and his survival. I looked at the canvas sitting on the desk. I thought about the cruel laughter of Cameron. I thought about the cold, dead eyes of my father as he threw the masterpiece of my son into the ashes. They wanted us to fail. They expected me to remain in the gutter. But looking at the beautiful, mathematically perfect creation of my son, I knew I could not stop fighting. I folded the piece of paper with the academy name and shoved it firmly into my pocket. I did not have the money, but I had the truth. My son was a genius, and I was going to force the world to open its doors for him no matter whose throat I had to step on to make it happen. I spent the next 3 nights compiling the application for the Vanguard Art Academy. I took high-resolution photographs of the ash-stained canvas, documenting every angle of the geometric spirals. I attached the clinical evaluation from Dr. Aris, detailing the savant syndrome diagnosis, and explicitly stating that Leo required their specialized artistic and sensory environment. The application fee alone was just $100. I skipped paying my water bill to cover the cost washing Leo with cold water from the sink for a week. I submitted the portfolio with a formal request for their Endowment for Gifted Youth, a massive financial grant designed to cover full tuition for exceptional cases. I waited for exactly 14 days. During those 2 weeks, my physical exhaustion reached dangerous new levels. I was surviving on coffee and adrenaline, scrubbing corporate floors at night and checking my rusted mailbox every morning. Then the thick cream-colored envelope arrived. The Vanguard crest was embossed in gold ink on the front. I tore it open with shaking hands while standing in the hallway of my apartment building. The rejection letter was not just a denial, it was a masterclass in elitist cruelty. They did not even request an in-person interview or a live portfolio review. The admissions director, a woman named Beatrice, had signed a typed letter stating that while the submitted artwork was interesting, the academy was not a medical facility. The letter explicitly stated that the severe autism of my son presented an unmanageable liability to their staff and their other neurotypical students. They claimed his nonverbal status and sensory aversions would disrupt the prestigious learning environment. They threw his application out simply because they viewed his disability as a burden. I crushed the expensive parchment paper in my fist. They had not even looked at my son. They looked at a medical label and shut the door in his face. It was the exact same disgust my father had shown, just packaged in polite corporate phrasing. I refused to accept defeat. I was not the same terrified girl who had cowered in the driveway of my father. I took my anger and weaponized it. I started spending every single 30-minute lunch break at the medical clinic glued to the public computer in the break room. I ignored my exhausted coworkers and stopped eating lunch entirely. I dove deep into federal and state disability advocacy laws, scouring educational discrimination statutes and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I read legal precedents involving private institutions that accepted public grant money. I printed out hundreds of pages of legal jargon highlighting clauses with a bright yellow marker while eating leftover crackers from the clinic vending machine. It took me 9 days of relentless searching to find the exact loophole I needed. The Vanguard Art Academy was a private institution, but their endowment for gifted youth was partially subsidized by a federal arts and humanities grant. That single connection meant they were legally bound by federal anti-discrimination mandates. They could not legally deny an applicant an in-person evaluation solely based on a medical diagnosis of autism, without providing a formal documented assessment proving the child could not perform the core functions of the program. I drafted a fierce, legally binding demand letter using templates I found online. I cited the specific federal statutes they were violating. I stated clearly that if they did not grant Leo a formal in-person hearing before the admissions board, I would file a massive discrimination lawsuit with the Department of Education and drag their prestigious reputation through the local media. I printed the letter at the clinic, paid $5. I did not have to send it by certified overnight mail, and waited. 48 hours later, my cheap prepaid phone rang. It was Beatrice, the admissions director. Her voice was dripping with forced politeness and barely concealed rage. She informed me that the board of directors would grant us exactly 20 minutes to present our case in person the following Tuesday. She warned me that the board members were exceptionally busy people and that this courtesy interview would not change their final decision. I simply thanked her, hung up the phone, and went to a discount craft store to buy 2 cheap blank canvases and 6 tubes of acrylic paint. On Tuesday morning, I walked into the gleaming glass and steel skyscraper in Manhattan that housed the Vanguard Art Academy executive offices. I held the hand of Leo tightly. He was wearing his favorite soft cotton shirt, holding a small red rubber ball that he squeezed rhythmically to calm his nerves. I carried a large tote bag slung over my shoulder. A receptionist escorted us into a massive boardroom overlooking the city skyline. 5 board members sat behind a long mahogany table, their expressions identical masks of impatience and superiority. Beatrice sat in the center, flanked by wealthy art critics and academy executives. They looked at Leo with blatant discomfort as he immediately avoided eye contact and began rocking slightly on his heels. "You have 20 minutes, Ms. Anderson," Beatrice announced coldly, checking her expensive watch. "Please understand that while we sympathize with the condition of your son, our curriculum is highly rigorous. We simply do not have the resources to manage severe behavioral issues. We are an art academy, not a special education daycare center." I did not say a word in response. I did not beg or plead or explain the genius of my son. I simply walked up to the edge of the mahogany table, unzipped my tote bag, and pulled out a blank white canvas. I laid it flat on the polished wood, right in front of Beatrice. I pulled out the 6 tubes of acrylic paint and squeezed thick pools of cerulean blue, burnt orange, and vivid yellow directly onto the white surface. The board members gasped in outrage, pushing their expensive chairs back to avoid the paint. "What on earth are you doing?" a man in a tailored suit shouted, standing up in protest and brushing off his silk tie. "You cannot bring wet paint into an executive boardroom." I stepped back and gently guided Leo toward the table. I did not give him any instructions. I did not hand him a brush. I simply pointed to the canvas and stepped entirely out of his way. Leo looked at the pools of color. His rocking stopped instantly. The anxiety drained from his small body, replaced by a hyper-focused, absolute stillness that always preceded his work. He reached both of his bare hands into the thick paint. For the next 18 minutes, the boardroom was entirely silent except for the wet, rhythmic slapping of paint against canvas. The 5 elite board members watched, completely paralyzed by shock, as my 6-year-old non-verbal autistic son executed a live masterpiece. Both of his hands moved simultaneously, mirroring each other with brutal, flawless mathematical precision. He pulled the cerulean and orange together into a sweeping, complex, geometric fractal that seemed to leap off the flat surface. He did not pause to think. The image was already fully constructed in his mind. He was simply transferring it to the physical world. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a towel I had provided, grabbed his red rubber ball, and went to stand quietly by the window. I looked at the board members. Their mouths were quite literally hanging open. The man who had shouted earlier was leaning over the table, his eyes wide, tracing the impossible symmetry of the fractal without touching it. Beatrice was gripping the edge of her chair, her face pale with humiliation and sudden, undeniable awe. "Does his autism still look like an unmanageable liability to you?" I asked, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. "Or does it look like the most brilliant thing to ever walk through your front doors?" Beatrice swallowed hard, unable to tear her eyes away from the wet canvas. "We will cover everything," she whispered, her arrogant facade completely shattered. "Full tuition, the specialized behavioral therapists, the sensory integration equipment. We will grant him the full endowment starting Monday." I nodded, packed up my empty paint tubes, took the hand of my son, and walked out of the boardroom. The financial crisis that had threatened to suffocate us was instantly solved. I had secured a multi-million-dollar education for Leo without paying a single dime. But as the elevator descended toward the street, a cold realization settled in my stomach. I had just proved the undeniable, lucrative genius of my son to a room full of powerful, connected art elites. I had won the battle, but I had just placed a massive target directly on his back. The art world was ruthless, and the predators were about to start circling. The next 4 years were a brutal, exhausting education in the dark underbelly of the high-end art market. The scholarship to the Vanguard Art Academy saved Leo academically and therapeutically, providing him with a sanctuary where his savant syndrome was nurtured rather than punished. His artistic output during this time was nothing short of miraculous. By the time he was 10 years old, his canvases were massive, sprawling landscapes of emotional geometry. He was layering acrylics, oils, and sometimes crushed glass, creating 3-dimensional fractals that seemed to pulse with trapped, frantic energy. His work was undeniably brilliant. The problem was not his talent. The problem was the vultures. As Leo produced more work, his instructors at Vanguard naturally wanted to showcase his progress. They invited local gallery owners and private dealers to private end-of-year exhibitions. I thought this was a wonderful opportunity. I thought the art world would celebrate a neurodivergent child prodigy. I was incredibly naive. The first major gallery owner to approach me was a man named Silas Thorne. He ran a prestigious, ultra-exclusive gallery in Chelsea. He offered me a predatory, insultingly low contract. He wanted to buy 5 of the largest canvases of Leo for a flat fee of $2,000 each. He then handed me a contract that gave his gallery exclusive lifetime rights to represent Leo, allowing Silas to take an 80% commission on all future sales. When I balked at the terms, Silas did not negotiate. He sneered at me. "Ms. Anderson," he said, smoothing his expensive silk tie, "you are a single mother working as a receptionist. Your son is severely autistic and completely nonverbal. He cannot attend gallery openings. He cannot shake hands with wealthy collectors. He cannot schmooze at elite dinner parties. The art market is about personality and presentation as much as it is about the canvas. Without a seasoned, aggressive gallery to package and sell his tragic little backstory, these paintings are just colorful wall decorations. Take the $10,000 and consider yourself lucky." I did not take the money. I took the paintings, loaded them into the back of my rusted sedan, and drove away. But Silas was not the only vulture. Over the next year, 5 different gallery owners tried the exact same tactic. They all saw a vulnerable, low-income single mother and a disabled child, and they smelled blood in the water. They wanted to exploit the disability of Leo, market him as a tragic sideshow attraction, pay us pennies and pocket millions. The cruelty of the corporate art world was staggering, and it reminded me far too much of the ruthless exploitation my father built his real estate empire on. I realized that as long as the art world saw a disabled child and a struggling single mother, they would never pay what the art was actually worth. They would only ever see weakness. So I decided to remove our weakness from the equation entirely. I decided to build a shield so thick and impenetrable that no predatory gallery owner could ever touch my son again. I spent 6 months saving every single spare dollar I had. I hired a specialized, ultra-discreet corporate attorney who dealt in anonymous trusts and international shell companies. Together we built a legal fortress. We created a corporate entity that existed solely on paper, registered in Delaware with no public-facing officers. I transferred full ownership of every single canvas Leo had ever painted into this trust. Then I created the persona. I stripped away the tragic backstory. I removed the age, the gender, the medical diagnosis, and the low-income struggle. I created a blank, faceless void. I named the persona Axiom. It was a mathematical term representing a statement or proposition which is regarded as being established, accepted, or self-evidently true. It was the perfect description of the art of my son. I stopped bringing the paintings to physical galleries. I cut off all in-person communication with dealers like Silas Thorne. Instead, I hired a professional photographer to take high-resolution, flawlessly lit images of the canvases. I created a stark, minimalist website on the dark web, accessible only by a rotating encrypted password. I began sending the password anonymously to a highly curated list of the top 200 international art collectors, billionaire venture capitalists, and elite museum curators. The website contained zero biographical information. There was no artist statement, no location, no explanation of the technique. There was only the art presented against a pitch-black background and an encrypted email address for blind, silent auctions. The strategy worked better than I could have ever imagined. The absolute silence and militant anonymity surrounding Axiom created an immediate, frantic buzz in the high-end art community. The elite collectors were used to artists begging for their attention, desperate for validation and cash. Axiom did not care about them. Axiom did not want to meet them. Axiom only wanted their money, and only if they were willing to bid blindly against each other in the dark. The mystery was intoxicating. The art was undeniably brilliant, but the utter lack of a persona made the paintings a blank canvas for the egos of the wealthy. They projected their own profound meanings onto the geometric fractals. They debated the hidden philosophical depth of the artist. The less I said, the more they paid. The first canvas sold to a tech billionaire in Tokyo for $400,000. The second went to a Russian hedge fund manager for $650,000. By the time Leo turned 12, a massive 6-foot mural of crushed glass and burnt orange acrylic sold at a blind digital auction for $2.1 million. We were no longer struggling. We moved out of the cramped studio and into a secure, heavily guarded luxury penthouse overlooking Central Park. I quit my job scrubbing floors and medical reception desks. I devoted myself full-time to managing the encrypted empire of Axiom. Leo had the absolute best behavioral therapists, private tutors, and sensory environments money could buy. He was happy, safe, and completely insulated from the toxic, predatory world outside our doors. But the massive, explosive success of Axiom created a new terrifying problem. As the prices skyrocketed into the multi-millions, the high-end art world stopped viewing Axiom as a fascinating mystery and started viewing the anonymity as a direct challenge. Wealthy, aggressive collectors are not used to being denied access. They believe that their money entitles them to own not just the art, but the artist. They wanted to know who they were handing millions of dollars to. They wanted the prestige of discovering the face behind the genius. The hunting began. Private investigators hired by obsessed billionaires started probing the encrypted servers. Elite art critics published massive speculative exposes trying to trace the style and technique back to known art academies. Hackers attempted to breach the blind auction platforms. The pressure was intense and unrelenting. I had to employ a full-time team of cybersecurity experts just to maintain the digital fortress, protecting the identity of Leo. We routed emails through dozens of international servers. We used specialized untraceable cryptocurrency accounts before funneling the clean money into the corporate trust. Every time we sold a painting, the logistics felt like planning a military operation. The paranoia was exhausting. I was terrified that someone would breach the firewall. I was terrified that a disgruntled instructor at Vanguard would recognize the specific geometric patterns and leak the truth to the press. If the elite art world discovered that the mysterious, brilliant Axiom was actually a severely autistic teenager, the narrative would shift instantly. The predators like Silas Thorne would return armed with expensive lawyers trying to prove that Leo was not legally competent to sell his own work, trying to seize control of the multi-million-dollar trust. Worse, I was terrified that the exposure would reach Connecticut. My father Donovan was a man who monitored the wealth of others obsessively. If he discovered that the defective grandson he had discarded in the ashes was now generating millions of dollars in the international art market, he would not hesitate. He would use his massive corporate legal team to claim that as the biological grandfather, he was entitled to a percentage of the estate. He would drag us back into the toxic, abusive hell I had spent years clawing my way out of. I was living in a gilded cage. We had unlimited resources, but I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the shield to crack. I realized that hiding behind encryption was no longer enough. The anonymous trust protected our money, but it did not give me the power to fight back if the predators breached the walls. I needed a physical presence. I needed a legitimate, terrifying corporate entity that could legally crush anyone who tried to exploit Leo or uncover his identity. I could no longer just be the silent proxy for Axiom. I needed to step out of the shadows and become a predator myself. I needed to build a fortress so massive and aggressive that the art world would be too terrified of the legal consequences to ever try and pull the mask off my son. I took $20 million from the anonymous corporate trust of Leo and went to war. I did not just want to build a wall around my son. I wanted to build an entire army. The elite art world had operated for centuries on the exploitation of the vulnerable. They took artists with severe neurodivergence, mental illness, and sensory processing disorders, paid them in exposure or pennies, and hoarded the vast profits for themselves. I was going to dismantle that system brick by brick. I founded Spectrum Canvas. It was not a traditional art gallery. It was a fiercely aggressive talent management agency and legal fortress dedicated exclusively to neurodivergent creators. I used my immense capital to poach the most ruthless intellectual property lawyers, contract negotiators, and public relations executives in Manhattan. I paid them double their corporate salaries with one strict mandate. They were to treat our artists not as charity cases, but as premium top-tier assets requiring absolute legal protection and maximum financial compensation. I made it clear that anyone who patronized or underestimated our talent pool would be fired immediately. Spectrum Canvas was going to be a sanctuary, but it was also going to be a fortress armed to the teeth. We started quietly. I sought out artists who possessed the same undeniable savant syndrome brilliance as Leo, but who were being actively crushed by the predatory gallery system. We found a young woman with severe obsessive-compulsive disorder who created breathtaking micro-mosaics from recycled technology. We found a non-verbal teenager who painted hyper-realistic cityscapes entirely from memory after a single helicopter ride. We found a sculptor with severe social anxiety who welded towering kinetic metal structures that sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were brilliant minds trapped in a system that viewed them as profitable circus acts rather than respected professionals. I approached their struggling parents and offered them something they had never seen before: total financial security and absolute legal control over their own work. We took the burden of negotiation off their shoulders completely. Spectrum Canvas took a flat, transparent 15% commission, completely disrupting the industry standard of 50 to 80%. In exchange, we provided our artists with lifetime health insurance, sensory integrated studio spaces, and a massive legal team that would annihilate any dealer who tried to print unauthorized merchandise or forge signatures. The art establishment was absolutely furious. Elite dealers sent me threatening legal notices. Pompous gallery owners launched smear campaigns in high society magazines claiming Spectrum Canvas was ruining the purity of the art market by commercializing disabled talent. They held panels and wrote lengthy editorial pieces accusing me of hoarding the best emerging artists. I ignored their noise. I countered their threats by weaponizing the immense hidden wealth of Axiom. Every time a competitor tried to blacklist one of our artists, I would casually leak a rumor that Axiom might be looking for a new exclusive digital platform. I would drop hints to the right journalists that Axiom was considering pulling all future artwork from the public market entirely. The greedy elite would instantly back off, terrified of losing a chance at securing the most lucrative mystery in the modern art world. They hated me, but they feared the power of Axiom more. Within 3 years, Spectrum Canvas became a massive, undeniable powerhouse. Our roster boasted 30 of the most profitable, highly sought-after neurodivergent artists on the globe. We were generating staggering revenue, and our corporate offices were expanding rapidly. But we were operating entirely out of leased, sterile corporate skyscrapers. To truly cement our dominance and provide a safe, permanent sanctuary for our artists to display their work, we needed a flagship physical gallery. We needed a permanent home in Manhattan that we owned outright. Finding the perfect property was agonizing. Traditional galleries were sensory nightmares for my clients. They featured harsh, echoing acoustics, blinding fluorescent spotlights, and cramped layouts that triggered intense anxiety. I needed a space that could be completely customized, acoustically dampened, and architecturally designed to soothe the nervous systems of neurodivergent individuals while still projecting absolute elite prestige to wealthy buyers. After 8 months of relentless searching, my lead real estate broker found the crown jewel. It was a massive, historic 5-story industrial building located in the heart of the Chelsea Art District. The structure boasted gorgeous exposed brick, massive skylights, providing diffused natural light, and structural soundproofing built into the original 19th century architecture. The floor plans were wide open, allowing for seamless navigation without overwhelming visual clutter. It had been tied up in probate court for a decade and was finally hitting the commercial market. It was an absolute unicorn property, a diamond hidden in the rough concrete of the city. I walked through the dusty, cavernous space and saw the future. I envisioned the ground floor transformed into a sprawling, sensory-friendly exhibition hall. The upper floors would be converted into private, custom-built studios for our artists, granting them a safe haven in the center of the city. I immediately authorized my broker to submit an aggressive bid of $22 million. It was $2 million over the asking price. I wanted to lock the deal down instantly, bypassing any protracted bidding wars. The seller, an exhausted estate executor, accepted the offer within 3 hours. We entered the standard 30-day escrow period. I hired top-tier architectural firms to begin drafting the renovation blueprints. I promised my artists that they would soon have a permanent, untouchable fortress to call their own. For the first time in over a decade, I felt completely secure. I had turned my trauma into a thriving empire, and I was about to plant my flag permanently into the concrete of Manhattan. Then on a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 4 days before we were scheduled to close the deal, the entire plan violently derailed. My lead real estate broker rushed into my office without knocking. His face was pale, his hands tightly gripping a thick manila folder. He was out of breath, looking like he had just sprinted 10 blocks to deliver the news in person. He threw the folder onto my desk. The seller was backing out of our contract. They were triggering a highly obscure, expensive penalty clause to break our escrow agreement. They were willing to walk away from a guaranteed $22 million because someone else had made them an offer they literally could not refuse. I stood up from my desk, my blood instantly running cold. "That is legally impossible," I stated sharply. "We offered $2 million over asking. We demonstrated absolute proof of funds. No one breaks a multi-million-dollar escrow agreement unless they are being threatened or bribed. Who exactly is trying to kill my deal?" My broker wiped sweat from his forehead. A massive corporate development firm just swooped in at the absolute last second. They did not just outbid us. They submitted a completely unhinged predatory offer designed to bully the seller into submission. They put down $30 million entirely in liquid cash. They are waiving every single inspection, ignoring the strict historic preservation status, and happily paying the multi-million-dollar escrow penalty on behalf of the seller just to force you out of the contract today. I stared at him in disbelief. $30 million in pure cash for a property valued at 20 was not a sound investment. It was an aggressive, hostile takeover designed to crush the competition. It was a blatant display of corporate violence. What developer would burn that much capital on a historic building just to steal it from an art agency? I demanded, pulling the legal documents from the folder. "They do not want the building for the art," my broker explained, his voice shaking slightly. "They bribe the city zoning officials. They plan to petition the city to condemn the historic structure entirely. They are going to demolish the entire 5-story building and pave over it to construct a hideous, lucrative, high-density luxury condominium tower. They want the dirt it sits on, and they have the unlimited cash reserves to crush anyone who stands in their way." I scanned the heavy stack of legal documents, flipping past the financial disclosures and the aggressive purchase agreements. I was searching for the name of the corporate entity that was trying to destroy the future of my agency. I needed to know which massive hedge fund or international conglomerate I was going up against. My eyes landed on the embossed logo at the top of the rival offer letterhead. A sharp, icy shock slammed directly into my chest, stealing the air completely from my lungs. The room seemed to spin as I stared at the bold, arrogant font printed on the expensive legal paper. The aggressive all-cash offer did not come from an anonymous hedge fund. It did not come from a faceless international conglomerate. It came from a highly recognized, ruthless, Connecticut-based real estate development firm. It was the exact same firm that had funded the $90,000 sports car. It was the exact same firm that was built on exploiting the weak, crushing the vulnerable, and destroying anything that did not fit into their perfect, pristine image. The corporate developer attempting to tear down my sanctuary, demolish the safe haven I had promised my artists, and pave over the future of my agency was none other than my own father, Donovan. He was back, and he was trying to destroy my life all over again. I collapsed back into my leather executive chair, the heavy stack of legal documents slipping from my numb fingers and scattering across the polished mahogany desk. The embossed logo of my father's real estate firm glared up at me, a mocking reminder of the past I had spent 9 years trying to bury. Vanguard Properties. The name was synonymous with ruthless acquisitions, predatory development, and absolute corporate dominance in the Connecticut and New York markets. I picked up the aggressive purchase agreement and read the signatures at the bottom. The primary authorization did not belong to my father. It belonged to Cameron. My arrogant, incompetent golden child brother had apparently been promoted to vice president of acquisitions. He was the one orchestrating this hostile takeover. He was the one throwing around $30 million in liquid cash to demolish my future flagship gallery. My broker, still standing nervously by the door, cleared his throat. Ms. Anderson, what do you want to do? The seller has technically accepted their escrow penalty. We have less than 72 hours before Vanguard legally finalizes the purchase and files the demolition permits. We need to counter their offer or walk away immediately. We are absolutely not walking away, I stated coldly, my voice steadying as the initial shock morphed into a sharp, focused rage. And we are not going to counter their offer. That building is zoned as a Class A historic structure. It is legally protected from complete demolition unless the city zoning board explicitly condemns it due to severe unfixable structural damage. My broker nodded hesitantly. That is true, but Vanguard has already submitted a preliminary engineering report to the zoning board. The report claims the foundation is sinking and the load-bearing walls are compromised beyond repair. They are arguing that the building is a public safety hazard and must be torn down. I scoffed loudly. I walked through that building myself with 3 independent structural engineers before we made our initial $22 million offer. The foundation is solid bedrock. The walls are perfect. Cameron did not find structural damage. He bought a fraudulent engineering report, and he is bribing the zoning officials to push the condemnation through quickly so he can build his luxury condos. This was exactly the kind of dirty, underhanded tactic my father had taught Cameron. They believed that if you threw enough cash at a problem, the laws simply ceased to apply to you. But they had never tried to pull this kind of illegal stunt against me. I need you to pull every single public record related to Vanguard properties from the last 5 years. I instructed my broker, pacing the length of my office. I want every permit they have filed, every zoning exception they have been granted, and the names of every city official who signed off on their projects. I then picked up my desk phone and pressed the speed dial button for the elite legal team I had kept on retainer since founding Spectrum Canvas. Within 10 minutes, 3 of the most aggressive corporate litigators in Manhattan were sitting in my office reviewing the fraudulent engineering report Vanguard had submitted. We have a massive problem, I explained to the lawyers, leaning over the scattered documents. Vanguard Properties is attempting an illegal hostile takeover of our Chelsea property. They are using falsified engineering documents to condemn a historic building. I want an injunction filed immediately to halt their purchase, and I want an emergency hearing with the city zoning board. The lead litigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn, reviewed the paperwork and nodded. The injunction is easy. We can file an emergency stay based on the historic preservation laws. But an emergency hearing with the zoning board means a public legal battle. Vanguard will send their top executives. You will have to testify as the purchasing CEO of Spectrum Canvas to demonstrate standing. A cold wave of panic washed over me. I shook my head sharply. Absolutely not. I cannot be anywhere near that courtroom. My name cannot appear on any of the public filings, and I cannot testify in person. Evelyn frowned, clearly confused. Ms. Anderson, you are the CEO. If you do not appear, Vanguard will argue that Spectrum Canvas is just a shell company acting in bad faith. Why are you refusing to testify? I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office looking out over the city skyline. I could not tell Evelyn the full truth. I could not tell her that the CEO of Vanguard Properties was my abusive father, or that the vice president trying to demolish our building was my brother. If I walked into that courtroom and faced Donovan and Cameron, they would instantly realize that the terrified, impoverished daughter they had discarded in the ashes was now the CEO of a multi-million-dollar agency. They would dig into the finances of Spectrum Canvas. They would trace the funding back to the anonymous trust of Axiom. They would discover that my autistic son, the child they had legally labeled as defective, was currently generating millions of dollars in the international art market. My father was a predator. If he found out about the wealth of Leo, he would completely ignore the severance document he had forced me to sign. He would use his massive corporate legal team to file frivolous lawsuits, claiming that he was entitled to a percentage of the estate as the biological grandfather. He would drag us into years of agonizing, expensive litigation just to bleed us dry. I had spent 9 years building an impenetrable fortress to protect my son, and I was not about to hand my father the keys to the front gate. This has to be handled entirely through proxy, I instructed Evelyn, turning back to face the legal team. I will grant you full power of attorney to represent Spectrum Canvas in the hearings. You will argue the case based solely on the architectural merits and the fraudulent nature of the Vanguard engineering report. You are to keep my identity completely sealed under our corporate privacy clauses. Evelyn hesitated, tapping her pen against the desk. We can do that, but it puts us at a severe disadvantage. Vanguard will use your absence to paint our agency as shady and unreliable. Cameron Vance is arrogant, but he is backed by his father's unlimited legal budget. They will tear into us if we do not present a strong, unified front. I smiled, a cold, calculated expression that I had learned from surviving the art market. They are arrogant, Evelyn. That is exactly what we are going to use against them. Cameron thinks he is fighting a faceless, cowardly corporation. Let him think that. Let him walk into that hearing completely overconfident. I spent the next 48 hours working relentlessly from behind the scenes. I authorized Evelyn to hire 3 independent world-renowned structural engineering firms to conduct immediate emergency assessments of the Chelsea property. We paid them exorbitant rush fees to produce flawless, undeniable reports proving the building was structurally sound and historically significant. Simultaneously, my broker and I dug into the public records of Vanguard properties. We found a clear, undeniable pattern. In the last 3 years, Cameron had secured permits for 4 different luxury condo developments by submitting engineering reports from the exact same firm that had just condemned our Chelsea building. In every single case, the city zoning official who had signed off on the questionable permits was a man named Arthur Chen. We had found the connection. Cameron was not just bribing anyone, he was specifically paying off Arthur Chen to rubber stamp fraudulent demolition orders. On Friday morning, the emergency hearing convened at the city zoning board. I sat in my private office watching the live stream of the proceedings on my computer monitor. My stomach churned with anxiety, but my resolve was absolute. Cameron strutted into the hearing room wearing a tailored Italian suit, looking exactly as smug and entitled as he had 9 years ago. He was flanked by 3 expensive corporate lawyers. He sat at the defense table, smirking confidently, clearly believing this hearing was just a minor administrative hurdle before he demolished my building. Evelyn stood at the plaintiff table, looking calm, prepared, and entirely lethal. She did not waste time with opening pleasantries. She immediately submitted our 3 independent engineering reports directly to the board members. The reports submitted by Vanguard Properties are entirely fabricated, Evelyn stated clearly, her voice echoing through the chamber. The historic structure in Chelsea is completely sound. The claim that the foundation is failing is a deliberate, calculated lie designed to bypass historic preservation laws for corporate profit. Cameron rolled his eyes dramatically and leaned toward his microphone. This is a desperate stall tactic by a shell company that does not even have the courage to send its CEO to this hearing. Vanguard Properties relies on top-tier engineering assessments. The building is a hazard. Evelyn did not flinch. She simply pulled a thick stack of financial documents from her briefcase. If your engineering assessments are top-tier, Mr. Vance, why has your firm exclusively utilized a single, highly discredited engineering firm for your last 4 demolition permits? And why have all 4 of those highly questionable permits been approved by the exact same city zoning official, Arthur Chen? The entire hearing room fell dead silent. Arthur Chen, who was sitting on the review panel, went visibly pale. Cameron lost his smug smile instantly. He looked at his lawyers, panic flashing in his eyes. He had not expected a faceless shell company to dig into his bribery pipeline. We have submitted these records to the City Ethics Committee and the State Licensing Board. Evelyn continued ruthlessly. We are formally requesting that this board not only reject the fraudulent demolition permit for the Chelsea property, but also launch a full investigation into the permitting practices of Vanguard Properties. I watched the live stream from my office, a fierce, triumphant smile spreading across my face. Cameron had tried to play a dirty game against a ghost, and the ghost had just publicly humiliated him and exposed his corruption to the entire city. The board members, terrified of being implicated in a bribery scandal, immediately rejected the Vanguard demolition permit and suspended Arthur Chen pending an investigation. Vanguard was officially blocked from demolishing the building, which meant their $30 million all-cash offer was completely useless. They had just forfeited a massive non-refundable multi-million-dollar escrow penalty, and they had absolutely nothing to show for it. Spectrum Canvas secured the Chelsea property the very next morning. We had won. We had our flagship gallery. But as I signed the final closing documents, a deep, unsettling anxiety remained. I had successfully defended my empire without revealing my identity. But I knew my father. Donovan did not tolerate public humiliation, and he certainly did not tolerate losing millions of dollars. He was going to hunt down the faceless CEO who had just decimated his golden child, and the real war was only just beginning. The aftermath of the preliminary zoning board hearing was swift and vicious. Vanguard Properties did not accept defeat gracefully. Within 24 hours of the initial suspension of their demolition permits, my father unleashed his entire corporate legal division. They filed a massive injunction in the state Supreme Court, attempting to forcefully overturn the zoning board decision and compel the estate executor to honor their $30 million all-cash offer. Donovan was bleeding money from the delay, but his pride demanded absolute victory. He could not stomach losing a prime Manhattan real estate deal to an agency he deemed insignificant. Cameron, eager to prove his worth to our father and furious at being publicly humiliated, decided to turn the legal battle into a media spectacle. He arranged a press conference on the grand marble steps of the courthouse, just an hour before the final ruling was scheduled. I watched the live broadcast from the safety of my private executive office, my hands folded tightly on my mahogany desk. Cameron stood before a cluster of local reporters and real estate bloggers, flanked by his expensive attorneys. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit and a smile that oozed unearned arrogance. He was playing the role of the visionary corporate leader, completely blind to the trap closing around him. Vanguard Properties has always been committed to urban revitalization, Cameron announced into the cluster of microphones. We are currently facing a baseless smear campaign orchestrated by an anonymous, cowardly competitor. This so-called art agency is hiding behind shell companies and false ethical outrage because they lack the capital to compete with us in a free market. The claims of bribery are completely fabricated, and we are fully confident that the judge will throw out their ridiculous interference today. We will finalize our permits, and we will crush this anonymous competitor. I listened to the arrogant boasting of my brother with a cold, calculated calm. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the wealth of our father operated as an absolute shield against consequences. He had no idea that Veronica, my lead corporate litigator, was standing just off camera, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the fatal blow. I had authorized Veronica to move past local zoning disputes and bring in the heavy artillery. As Cameron finished his smug declaration of victory, Veronica stepped forward from the crowd of reporters. She did not raise her voice. She did not engage in theatrical posturing. She simply handed a thick, heavily sealed legal envelope directly to the lead attorney standing next to Cameron. "I am Veronica Montgomery representing Spectrum Canvas," she stated, her voice ringing clearly through the microphones. "Mr. Prescott, since you are so eager to discuss this matter publicly, you should inform the press about the contents of that envelope." The lawyer of Cameron tore open the seal. His eyes scanned the first page, and the color instantly drained from his face. He leaned over and whispered frantically into the ear of my brother. The arrogant smirk vanished from the face of Cameron, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Veronica turned to the cameras, her expression completely ruthless. 30 minutes ago, the federal authorities unsealed a sweeping indictment regarding the permitting practices of Vanguard Properties. Based on the financial records our agency uncovered and submitted to the regulatory authorities, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has officially launched a comprehensive audit of Vanguard Properties. They are currently seizing the hard drives and financial ledgers at your corporate headquarters in Connecticut to investigate a multi-million-dollar network of municipal bribery. The reporters erupted into a frenzy of shouted questions. Camera flashes strobed blindingly across the panicked face of Cameron. He stumbled backward, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. His lawyers immediately grabbed him by the arms and shoved him through the heavy brass doors of the courthouse, abandoning the press conference to flee from the media slaughter. The federal audit was the ultimate tactical nuke. I had not just stopped their demolition permit, I had exposed a massive systemic vein of corruption within the empire of my father. The federal investigation meant that every single bank account, escrow deposit, and corporate holding associated with Vanguard Properties was instantly frozen pending review. The legal fallout was immediate and utterly devastating for my father. Because the federal authorities had frozen their accounts, Vanguard Properties missed the mandatory transfer deadline for their $30 million escrow agreement. The estate executor, absolutely terrified of being legally implicated in a federal bribery investigation, officially terminated their purchase contract with cause. By breaching the escrow timeline due to criminal negligence, Vanguard Properties automatically forfeited their non-refundable multi-million-dollar deposit. $3 million in pure liquid cash vanished from the accounts of my father in a single afternoon. The money was seized as a penalty, leaving his firm bleeding capital with absolutely no property to show for it. With Vanguard officially and legally disqualified from the purchase, the estate executor immediately reverted to the backup offer. My broker received the phone call less than an hour after the disastrous press conference of my brother. Spectrum Canvas had officially secured the building. The historic 5-story property in Chelsea was legally ours. I sat in my office and let out a long, shuddering breath. We had done it. We had successfully defended the future of our neurodivergent artists, and we had secured a permanent fortress in the heart of the Manhattan Art District. But more importantly, I had just inflicted a massive, catastrophic financial wound upon the family that had discarded me, and I had done it without them ever seeing my face. Later that evening, my broker forwarded me an internal email that had been leaked from the Vanguard Properties Executive Board. The contents painted a picture of absolute chaos and rage. Donovan was entirely unhinged. The federal audit was threatening to tear his real estate empire apart from the inside out. Investors were panicking. Creditors were calling to call in their loans. The multi-million-dollar escrow forfeiture had decimated their quarterly operating budget. But what infuriated Donovan more than the money, more than the federal agents currently digging through his files, was the insult to his massive ego. He had been thoroughly and publicly beaten by a rival CEO who refused to step into the light. He demanded that his private investigators uncover the identity of the executive running Spectrum Canvas. He wanted a name. He wanted a face. He wanted someone to destroy. I knew my anonymity was hanging by a very fragile thread, but the corporate shielding I had built around Spectrum Canvas held strong. My name appeared on no public registries. The corporate ownership was buried under layers of Delaware-based shell companies and encrypted trust funds. Donovan was striking out blindly in the dark, screaming at a ghost. He had no idea that the brilliant, ruthless executive who had just cost his firm millions of dollars and triggered a federal investigation was the exact same daughter he had thrown into the freezing cold night 9 years ago. He did not know that the agency he was trying to crush was funded entirely by the autistic grandson he had legally labeled as defective. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and raised it to the empty room, toasting the silence. I had won the first major battle. My artists were safe, and Leo was completely secure in his private world, continuing to paint breathtaking mathematical masterpieces far away from the toxic greed of my family. But the victory was a double-edged sword. By crippling Vanguard Properties so severely, I had pushed my father into a corner. Desperate men with massive egos do not simply retreat and accept defeat. They lash out. Donovan was bleeding money, and he was going to need a massive, unprecedented influx of clean capital to save his crumbling empire from the federal auditors. He was going to start hunting for a miracle. He was going to start looking for a way to launder prestige and appease his increasingly ruthless investors. And in the high-end, cutthroat world of New York finance, there was only one thing more valuable than prime real estate: exclusive, untraceable fine art. I knew it was only a matter of time before the desperation of my father led him directly toward the most lucrative anonymous art phenomenon on the global market. I knew he was going to start looking for Axiom, The collision was no longer just a possibility. It was an absolute terrifying certainty. I had to prepare my legal team and fortify my agency for the day Donovan Prescott walked through our front doors, completely unaware that he was stepping directly into a trap set by the daughter he had thrown away. The foundation of his fraudulent business was cracking, and the resulting debris would soon fall right at my doorstep. I spent the weekend reinforcing our security protocols and ensuring my personal identity remained totally obscured. I was no longer a victim waiting for a blow. I was a predator waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. The dust from the Chelsea building acquisition settled, but the war was far from over. Time moved forward, and I meticulously fortified my empire against any future attacks. I am now 34 years old. My son Leo is a brilliant, thriving 15-year-old. He has grown into a tall, observant teenager who moves through the world with a quiet, intense grace. We transformed the entire top floor of our historic Manhattan building into his private, custom-designed sanctuary. The acoustics are perfectly dampened to prevent any sensory overload. The lighting is completely natural, filtering through ultraviolet protected skylights that cast a warm glow across his massive studio. In this flawless environment, Leo paints canvases that are 10 feet tall. He does not use standard brushes anymore. He uses custom-built tools to layer geometric rivers of gold leaf, crushed lapis lazuli, and thick midnight blue oils, creating visual mathematics that utterly defy human comprehension. Axiom is no longer just a viral dark web sensation. He is an absolute titan of the modern art world. His pieces hang in the private vaults of international royalty and tech billionaires. And through it all, his true identity remains buried safely behind the impenetrable legal armor of Spectrum Canvas. Meanwhile, the real estate empire of my father was rotting from the inside out. The federal audit I triggered all those years ago acted like a slow, lethal venom in the veins of Vanguard Properties. The government investigators had combed through every single building permit, bank account, and zoning application my father had ever filed. The resulting negative press spooked his most reliable investors and permanently tarnished his pristine public image. Major banks refused to extend his lines of credit. To keep up the facade of immense wealth and power, my father had to dip into his personal liquid reserves just to keep the lights on at his corporate headquarters. But the fatal blow did not come from the federal government. It came from the sheer, unchecked incompetence of his golden child. Cameron, desperate to prove he was a visionary executive and terrified of losing his luxury lifestyle, panicked. With their traditional funding avenues blocked by the ongoing audit, Cameron sought unregulated capital to fund a series of catastrophic high-risk commercial developments. He took out massive predatory loans leveraging commercial properties that Vanguard did not even legally own yet. He walked right into the jaws of the most dangerous predator in the New York financial district. His name was Harrison. Harrison was a notorious, ruthless venture capitalist. He did not build companies, he butchered them. He preyed on bleeding real estate firms, offering massive cash injections with brutal, ironclad default clauses that stripped the borrower of all legal protections. He was a corporate shark who delighted in bankrupting generational wealth. Cameron, completely blind to the danger and blinded by his own arrogance, convinced my father to accept an $8 million loan from the firm of Harrison. They used the cash to blindly patch the gaping financial holes in their sinking ship. But real estate requires patience, and Harrison did not offer any. The commercial market shifted, the rush development projects stalled, and the $8 million note matured with staggering, insurmountable interest. The deadline was now exactly 5 days away. If Vanguard Properties defaulted on the $8 million the contract Cameron signed, granted Harrison the absolute legal right to seize every single corporate and personal asset my father possessed. Harrison could legally take their office buildings, their frozen bank accounts, the fleet of luxury sports cars, and the sprawling Connecticut estate where I was exiled. My father was staring directly down the barrel of total public bankruptcy. He was days away from losing the only thing he actually loved, which was his wealth and his status. Donovan needed a miracle. He could not generate $8 million in liquid cash in 5 days, so he needed an asset powerful enough to act as immediate collateral. He needed something so universally coveted, so deeply prestigious, that Harrison would accept it in lieu of immediate payment to extend the terms of the loan. Harrison was known for two things in elite financial circles. He was known for destroying vulnerable companies, and he was known for his obsessive, almost fanatical collection of exclusive fine art. Harrison used ultra-rare artwork to hide his wealth from the government and launder his corporate prestige among high society. He had spent millions trying to acquire a piece by the legendary artist Axiom, but he had lost every single blind digital auction my agency had hosted. He was absolutely desperate to own an Axiom original, viewing it as the ultimate unattainable status symbol that money seemingly could not buy. My father, operating with the frantic, terrified energy of a cornered animal, discovered this specific vulnerability. Donovan realized that if he could somehow secure a private custom commission from Axiom, he could hand the masterpiece directly to Harrison. An exclusive Axiom commission would easily be appraised at over $10 million in the current market. It would act as the ultimate bargaining chip. It would appease the ruthless investor, secure an extension on the massive loan, and save Vanguard Properties from total annihilation. There was just one massive, impenetrable obstacle standing in the way of my father. Axiom did not speak to the public. Axiom did not attend gallery openings. Axiom did not take private commissions under any circumstances. And the only way to even submit a formal request to the legendary artist was by going directly through the exclusive legal representation of Spectrum Canvas. Donovan had to go crawling on his hands and knees to the exact same agency he had tried to demolish with fraudulent engineering reports just a few years prior. The irony was absolutely delicious. My father was bleeding to death financially, and the only tourniquet in the entire world was held by the faceless CEO he deeply despised. The aggressive communications began on a Tuesday morning. My lead receptionist forwarded a frantic, demanding email from the corporate accounts of Vanguard Properties. Donovan did not ask for a meeting politely. He demanded immediate access to our head of talent management. He threw around his corporate title aggressively, stating that Vanguard Properties was prepared to offer an unprecedented sum of cash for a private audience with Axiom. He wrote the email with the distinct tone of a man who believed his money could force any door open. I sat in my executive suite reading the desperate emails of my father while sipping my morning coffee. I instructed my staff to implement our standard protocol for aggressive, unvetted buyers. We completely ignored him. Silence is a weapon that narcissists cannot tolerate. By Wednesday afternoon, the ignored emails turned into hostile phone calls. Cameron began leaving voicemails on our main agency line, his voice cracking with barely suppressed panic disguised as arrogance. He threatened to report our agency to the Better Business Bureau for refusing to engage with a legitimate corporate offer. He claimed they were close personal friends with high-ranking city officials who could make life very difficult for our gallery operations. It was the pathetic, hollow flailing of a man who knew he was days away from losing his luxury lifestyle and his expensive cars. I listened to the voicemails of my brother with a cold, clinical satisfaction. They had absolutely no idea who they were threatening. They were screaming at a brick wall, completely oblivious to the fact that I was sitting comfortably on the other side, watching them drown in their own panic. By Thursday morning, exactly 4 days before the loan deadline of Harrison, the desperation of my father reached its absolute breaking point. He bypassed the reception desk entirely and sent a direct, certified legal courier to my Chelsea building. The courier delivered a heavy, wax-sealed envelope addressed simply to the Chief Executive Officer of Spectrum Canvas. I opened the envelope with a silver letter opener. The letter inside was a masterpiece of corporate begging disguised as a commanding business proposal. Donovan formally demanded an in-person meeting at our Manhattan headquarters for the following afternoon. He stated that he would be arriving with his Vice President Cameron and his wife Joanne to discuss a multi-million-dollar private commission that would mutually benefit both of our prestigious organizations. He practically demanded that the CEO be present to greet them, insisting that a deal of this magnitude required face-to-face negotiations between the top executives. I placed the heavy, expensive paper flat on my mahogany desk. I smoothed the crisp edges with my fingertips. I thought about the cold, freezing night in Connecticut 9 years ago. I thought about the shattered glass, the dark soot covering the hands of my terrified 6-year-old son, and the cruel, mocking laughter of my brother. I thought about the cruel legal document my father had forced me to sign, permanently exiling us from his empire to protect his pristine reputation from the embarrassment of a struggling single mother. He wanted a meeting. He wanted to march into my fortress, throw his fading wealth around, and demand a financial miracle from the child he had legally labeled as defective. I pressed a button on my intercom system, connecting directly to my lead security director and my front desk manager. Vanguard Properties will be arriving tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. You are to grant them access to the building, escort them directly to the main executive lobby on the 3rd floor. Do not offer them any water or refreshments. Do not make them comfortable. I want them to wait exactly 15 minutes before I step out of my office to greet them personally. They need to feel the anticipation. They need to feel incredibly small in the presence of our architecture before I tear their entire world apart. The trap was officially set. The perimeter was completely secured. The corporate ghost they hated was finally going to step out of the shadows. Donovan, Joanne, and Cameron were about to walk straight into the heart of my empire, completely unaware that the powerful executive they were desperate to impress was the exact same daughter they had thrown away. The countdown to their absolute destruction had just begun, and I was going to savor every single second of their panic. The heavy steel doors of the private executive elevator glided open precisely at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon. I stood perfectly still behind the sleek minimalist marble reception desk in the 3rd floor lobby. The space was designed to be intimidatingly beautiful, featuring towering ceilings, sound-dampening acoustic panels, and massive striking pieces of neurodivergent art spotlit against dark gray walls. I had deliberately dismissed my actual reception staff for the afternoon, taking the position myself. I wore a tailored slate gray suit, with absolutely no visible designer logos, my hair pulled back into a severe practical knot. I wanted to look exactly like the invisible, easily dismissed corporate drone my family expected me to be. Donovan stepped out of the elevator first, leading the charge with his usual aggressive chest-out posture. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, but I could immediately see the fraying edges of his confidence. His skin looked sallow under the gallery lights, and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the crushing, sleepless anxiety of his impending $8 million loan default. Cameron followed closely behind him, clutching an expensive leather briefcase like a shield. Joanne trailed them both, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor, her eyes sweeping the room with a practiced, judgmental sneer. They marched purposefully toward the reception desk, entirely focused on projecting dominance. They were 10 feet away when my mother finally looked directly at my face. Joanne stopped dead in her tracks. Her sharp intake of breath echoed loudly in the quiet, cavernous lobby. Cameron bumped into her shoulder, annoyed by the sudden halt, before his gaze followed hers and locked onto me. The arrogant swagger evaporated from his posture instantly. Donovan frowned, irritated by the delay of his entourage, and finally turned his eyes toward the desk. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolute silence consumed the room. The shock rolling across their features was visceral. They were staring at the daughter they had discarded in the freezing ashes 9 years ago, the sister they had relentlessly mocked, the woman they had legally severed from their pristine bloodline to protect their country club reputation. Joanne was the first to recover from the paralysis. Her shock rapidly morphed into a familiar, venomous condescension. She stepped forward, her eyes raking over my unbranded gray suit and pulled back hair. She let out a short, breathy laugh of pure disbelief. "Whitney," Joanne said, her voice dripping with toxic pity. "My goodness. When the security guard downstairs said we would be greeted by an administrative assistant, I never in a million years imagined it would be you. I suppose we should not be surprised. You always did have a knack for finding your way to the bottom of the corporate ladder. Cameron let out a loud, barking laugh, his confidence returning in a rush, as he realized I was standing behind a reception desk. Wow, he sneered, leaning heavily against the marble counter. You really hit the big time, did you not, Whitney? Answering phones and fetching coffee in Chelsea. Dad, look at this. The runaway single mother finally got a real job. Did you have to scrub the floors here before they let you answer the phones? I kept my expression completely blank. I did not clench my jaw. I did not glare. I let their insults wash over me like water over stone. They were looking at a billionaire CEO, but their inherent blinding arrogance only allowed them to see a helpless receptionist. Donovan did not laugh. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask about his grandson. He simply looked at me with the exact same expression of profound disgust he had worn 9 years ago. He slapped his hand flat against the marble desk, demanding my immediate obedience. I do not have the time or the patience for a family reunion today, Donovan barked, his voice echoing harshly off the gallery walls. I am here on urgent multi-million-dollar business. I sent a certified courier demanding a private audience with the chief executive officer of Spectrum Canvas. You are going to pick up that phone, Whitney, and you are going to fetch the boss right now. Tell them Donovan Vance is waiting, and I do not like to be kept waiting. I looked directly into the furious, bloodshot eyes of my father. I maintained a flawless, sterile customer service voice, the kind designed to infuriate arrogant men who demanded immediate compliance. I am afraid that will not be possible, sir, I stated clearly, clasping my hands together on the desk. The Chief Executive Officer of Spectrum Canvas does not take unscheduled in-person meetings under any circumstances. Furthermore, I have reviewed your emailed proposal regarding a private commission from Axiom. I am officially informing you that Axiom does not accept private corporate commissions. The artist works strictly on their own schedule, and our agency does not facilitate direct transactions of that nature. The face of Donovan turned a dangerous mottled shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He was a man drowning in $8 million of debt, and a receptionist was standing between him and his only life raft. Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little brat, Donovan hissed, leaning his entire upper body over the marble counter, invading my personal space. I am the CEO of Vanguard Properties. I brought $30 million in liquid cash to the table for this building just a few weeks ago. I am offering a massive, unprecedented sum of money for a single piece of canvas. You are going to get your boss out here immediately, or I swear to God I will have you fired by the end of the day. I will personally ensure you never work in this city again. I will have you back on the streets where you belong. Joanne stepped up beside him, crossing her arms tightly. You really should listen to your father, Whitney. You are already living on the edge of poverty. Do not jeopardize your pathetic little job just to act out some childish grudge against us. We are offering your agency a fortune. Go fetch your superior before you ruin this for yourself. Cameron smirked, pulling out his cell phone. I can literally buy this entire agency and fire you myself by tomorrow morning, he taunted, completely oblivious to the fact that his firm was currently under a massive federal audit. Stop playing games, Whitney. Go get the boss. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. I looked at the three of them, suffocating in their own desperate arrogance. They needed this art commission to survive. They needed it to appease Harrison, the ruthless venture capitalist, who was sharpening his knives to carve up their entire estate. I let out a soft, defeated sigh, playing the role of the intimidated, compliant employee who had finally been bullied into submission. I lowered my gaze, adopting a posture of nervous hesitation. I cannot get the CEO. I whispered, my voice trembling with manufactured fear. They will fire me if I interrupt their schedule. An Axiom truly does not take commissions. It is a strict contractual stipulation. If I break it, I lose my job. Donovan slammed his fist on the desk again. Then what good are you? I quickly opened the top drawer of the reception desk. I have something else, I offered, frantically pulling out a heavy matte black envelope sealed with a silver wax stamp. I slid it across the marble counter toward my father. He snatched it up immediately, tearing the seal open with ruthless impatience. Inside the envelope were 3 heavy metal VIP access passes. They were laser-etched with the Spectrum Canvas logo and a simple, elegant geometric fractal. Axiom is not taking commissions because the artist has spent the last year preparing for their first-ever physical exhibition, I explained, keeping my tone hushed and secretive. It is a highly classified invite-only gala taking place this Saturday night at our main exhibition hall downstairs. The event is strictly limited to the top tier of global collectors. The centerpiece of the auction will be a massive unseen original work by Axiom. Donovan stared at the 3 metal passes in his hand. The anger in his eyes was instantly replaced by a ravenous, blinding greed. The gears in his head were spinning furiously. He realized he did not need a private commission if he could publicly purchase an Axiom original at a highly publicized elite gala. Buying the piece in front of an audience of billionaires would not just secure the asset he needed for Harrison, it would act as a massive public laundering of his own prestige. It would broadcast to the entire financial district that Vanguard Properties was still liquid, still powerful, and still dominating the market despite the federal audit. Joanne leaned over to look at the passes, her eyes lighting up with the promise of high society exposure. "This is an exclusive auction," she asked, her tone shifting to one of greedy anticipation. "Who else is on the guest list?" "Everyone who matters in the international art and finance sectors," I replied smoothly. "Hedge fund managers, international royalty, and top-tier venture capitalists. It will be the most significant networking event of the decade. I am not supposed to give those VIP passes out to walk-ins, but I can register the 3 of you as elite bidders if you promise not to mention my involvement to the CEO." Donovan let out a harsh, victorious laugh. He slipped the metal passes into the breast pocket of his tailored suit, looking at me with a mixture of triumph and absolute disdain. He believed he had just successfully bullied a weak, desperate receptionist into handing him the exact lifeline his sinking company needed. "You always were easily intimidated," Whitney Donovan sneered, adjusting his cuffs. "It is good to see you finally learned your place in the corporate food chain. We will take the passes. We will be at the auction on Saturday, and we will purchase the centerpiece. Ensure our bidder registration is flawless." Cameron leaned over the desk one last time, grinning maliciously. "Thanks for the tickets, sis. Try not to get fired before the weekend. Maybe if you beg, Dad will let you wash his new car after the gala." They turned in unison and marched back toward the private elevator. They did not say goodbye. They did not ask where my son was. They simply took what they believed they had forcefully extracted and walked away completely triumphant. The heavy steel doors slid shut behind them, sealing them into the descending cab. I stood alone in the quiet, cavernous executive lobby. The performance was over. The terrified, submissive facade melted away instantly, replaced by a cold, lethal satisfaction. I reached under the desk and hit a button, locking the elevator access codes for the rest of the day. Donovan thought he had just bullied a receptionist into handing him a miracle. He had absolutely no idea that I had just personally handed him the exact rope he would use to hang himself. He wanted an audience of billionaires. He wanted to flaunt his fake wealth. He wanted to buy an Axiom original to save his dying empire. I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. I was going to put him front and center on the most exclusive stage in Manhattan. And then I was going to trigger the trap, lock the doors, and watch his entire world burn to ash. The minute the elevator doors sealed my family inside, I abandoned the reception desk and returned to my executive office. I had exactly 48 hours to meticulously stage the destruction of Vanguard Properties. The gala was already planned to absolute perfection, but I needed to alter the seating arrangements and the VIP access list to accommodate a very specific, extremely dangerous apex predator. I needed Harrison. My financial analyst had already compiled a comprehensive dossier on the ruthless venture capitalist. Harrison did not attend public galas. He abhorred the press and despised rubbing elbows with the new money tech billionaires who usually flooded these events. He operated in the shadows, seizing vulnerable companies and stripping them for parts. But I also knew about his singular obsessive weakness. He was a fanatic collector of contemporary neurodivergent art, and he had spent the last 3 years losing every single blind digital auction for an Axiom original. I drafted a highly encrypted, untraceable email and routed it directly to the private fixer of Harrison. I did not include a standard invitation. I sent a single high-resolution, heavily watermarked macro photograph of the texture of the painting we were auctioning. I attached a brief, undeniably authoritative message. I stated that Spectrum Canvas was hosting the first and only physical auction of a masterpiece by Axiom. I guaranteed him absolute privacy, offering him exclusive use of the suspended glass mezzanine that overlooked the main exhibition floor. I promised him the absolute best vantage point in the entire building to watch the bidding war unfold. The response arrived in my secure inbox less than 20 minutes later. Harrison accepted. The bait was taken. The final piece of the execution was locked into place. I spent Friday transforming the ground floor of our Chelsea property into a sensory-friendly architectural marvel. I refused to subject my artists or my son to the chaotic, blinding strobe lights and deafening acoustics of a traditional high society gala. I had my production team install soft ambient edge lighting that illuminated the canvases without casting harsh glare. The floors were layered with thick sound-dampening resin that absorbed the clattering of expensive heels. Classical musicians were positioned behind acoustic baffles, allowing their music to swell gently through the space without becoming an overwhelming wall of sound. The centerpiece of the entire exhibition was positioned at the far end of the hall, resting on a reinforced raised mahogany stage. It was covered by a heavy matte black velvet drape. Beneath that velvet lay the exact same canvas my father had thrown into the fireplace ashes 9 years ago. I had hired a world-class restoration team to carefully preserve the faint grayish-black soot marks around the outer edges of the canvas, framing the breathtaking, mathematically perfect geometric explosions of color that Leo had painted. It was a masterpiece born from cruelty, and it was about to become the instrument of my absolute vengeance. Saturday evening descended on Manhattan with a crisp electric chill. The street outside our Chelsea headquarters was completely cordoned off by private security. A fleet of sleek black town cars and armored luxury SUVs began pulling up to the curb. The flashbulbs of elite art journalists and high society photographers strobed aggressively against the historic brick facade of the building. The richest, most powerful billionaires in the world were stepping onto my property, eager to throw millions of dollars at the mystery of Axiom. I did not hide in my office. I wanted to be on the floor. I wanted to look my family in the eye right up until the moment the trap snapped shut on their necks. I wore a sharp structured black suit and carried a digital clipboard, blending in seamlessly as a high-level floor manager. I stood near the main entrance, orchestrating the flow of the elite guests while keeping a constant vigilant watch on the front doors. Harrison arrived first, slipping through a private side entrance flanked by 2 massive security contractors. I caught his eye as my staff escorted him directly to the suspended glass mezzanine. He looked down at the main floor like a hawk surveying a field of mice. He settled into his private leather chair, entirely obscured by the tinted glass, completely ready to watch the financial bloodbath. 10 minutes later, the main doors swung open, and the Vance family made their grand entrance. Donovan, Joanne, and Cameron did not simply walk into the gallery, they invaded it. They strutted past the velvet ropes with an aggressive, suffocating sense of entitlement. Donovan wore a custom tuxedo that strained slightly around his shoulders, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute arrogance. He believed he was the most important man in the room. He believed he was about to purchase his salvation. He had absolutely no idea that the man holding the deed to his impending bankruptcy was currently watching him from the dark glass box above. Joanne clung to the arm of my father, wearing a glittering emerald gown that screamed for attention. She immediately snapped her fingers at a passing waiter, treating the young man with immediate, dripping condescension. She snatched a crystal flute of champagne from his tray without offering a single word of thanks, complaining loudly to Cameron about the lack of red carpet valets. Cameron was busy adjusting his expensive cufflinks, scanning the room to see who was watching him. He looked like a man who had already won the lottery, totally oblivious to the federal agents currently dismantling his corporate life back in Connecticut. I stood perfectly still near a massive kinetic sculpture, watching them operate. They were predators who had forgotten how to hunt, relying entirely on the illusion of their wealth to intimidate the room. Cameron spotted me first. He nudged our father, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. Donovan turned his head, his eyes locking onto mine across the crowded gallery floor. The immediate visceral sneer of disgust that twisted his features was entirely predictable. He looked at my black suit, my clipboard, and my earpiece. In his mind, I was nothing more than glorified hired help, a pathetic, struggling woman who had begged for a job just to survive. He purposefully altered his path, steering Joanne and Cameron directly toward me. He wanted to assert his dominance. He wanted to make sure I knew exactly how small I was before he went to the auction stage to flaunt his fabricated wealth. "Well, look who managed to keep her job for another 48 hours," Donovan mocked, stopping inches from where I stood. His voice was pitched loud enough for the nearby tech executives to hear. "I was hoping you would be working the coat check tonight, Whitney. I needed someone reliable to hold my cashmere overcoat." Joanne let out a sharp, tittering laugh, taking a long sip of her champagne. "Really, Donovan, you shouldn't tease the staff. She has a very important clipboard. She is probably in charge of making sure the bathrooms have enough paper towels." Cameron leaned in close, the smell of expensive cologne and cheap gin rolling off his breath. "Enjoy the view from the bottom, sis," he whispered maliciously. "You are about to watch Dad drop $10 million on a painting just to prove a point. Maybe if you clean up the trash after the gala is over, I will leave a $20 tip in your apron." I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not back away. I looked at the three of them standing in the exact center of the multi-million-dollar fortress I had built with the money they threw away. I looked at the dark tinted glass of the mezzanine above them where Harrison was currently swirling a glass of bourbon waiting for the show to start. "I will make sure the floor is perfectly clear for you, Donovan," I replied, my voice chillingly calm and entirely devoid of fear. "I want you to have an absolutely unobstructed path to the auction stage. Tonight is going to be a milestone you will never, ever forget." Donovan scoffed, dismissing my words as the pathetic bravado of a defeated woman. He adjusted his bow tie, turned his back to me entirely, and marched his family toward the front row of the auction seating. He demanded that a group of European collectors vacate the prime seats so he could sit directly in the center aisle. He was making sure the auctioneer, the press, and the entire room would see his face when he raised his bidding paddle. I watched him settle into his chair, crossing his legs with supreme confidence. I raised my hand and tapped my earpiece, signaling my head of security. "Lock the perimeter," I instructed quietly. "Nobody leaves the exhibition floor. Tell the auctioneer to begin." The heavy mahogany doors at the front of the gallery swung shut with a resounding final thud. The ambient lights dimmed, plunging the audience into an intimate, focused shadow. A single blindingly bright spotlight snapped on, illuminating the black velvet drape covering the masterpiece on the stage. The low murmur of the billionaires and the elite collectors fell instantly silent. The trap was completely sealed. There was absolutely no way out. The auction was about to begin, and my father was about to willingly leap headfirst into his own grave. The auctioneer, imported directly from the most prestigious auction house in London, commanded the mahogany stage with absolute authority. For the first 2 hours, the grand exhibition hall transformed into a glittering battlefield of wealth and ego. The preliminary lots, consisting of neurodivergent artworks from our top-tier agency clients, sparked ferocious bidding wars. A kinetic metal sculpture by our socially anxious prodigy sold for $600,000. A hyper-realistic cityscape, painted entirely from memory, fetched an astonishing $1.2 million. The energy was electric, vibrating with the intoxicating thrill of high society consumption. I stood at my vantage point near the grand entrance, holding my digital clipboard, watching the elite attendees empty their massive bank accounts into the protective corporate trusts of my artists. My father sat in the center aisle, his posture rigid and tense. Donovan did not raise his bidding paddle for any of the preliminary pieces. He was conserving his rapidly depleting ammunition, waiting specifically for the ultimate prize that would supposedly save his crumbling real estate empire. Cameron fidgeted nervously beside him, checking his expensive watch every 5 minutes, while Joanne drank her fourth glass of vintage champagne, pretending she belonged among the billionaires. High above them, obscured completely by the tinted glass of the private mezzanine, Harrison watched the financial slaughter with predatory patience. The tension was suffocating. Everyone in the room knew the main event was approaching. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and desperate anticipation. Then the ambient lighting shifted. The soft, warm illumination that had bathed the gallery floor instantly narrowed, focusing entirely on the reinforced stage at the far end of the room. The low murmur of the crowd died away, replaced by a profound, expectant silence. The preliminary sales were officially concluded. It was time for the absolute pinnacle of the evening. The heavy wooden double doors at the back of the stage swung open. Two white-gloved art handlers emerged carefully, wheeling a massive reinforced easel into the center of the blinding spotlight. Resting on the easel was a canvas draped entirely in thick, matte black velvet. The fabric absorbed the harsh light, giving the hidden piece an aura of profound, terrifying gravity. The auctioneer stepped up to his podium, gripping his wooden gavel tightly. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping an octave to match the solemnity of the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, the sound echoing perfectly through the cavernous historic building. Tonight, Spectrum Canvas has offered you an exclusive glimpse into the minds of the brilliant and the neurodivergent. But this final lot is something entirely unprecedented. The artist, known globally as Axiom, has never before allowed a physical piece to be auctioned in a public forum. Tonight, we are not just selling a painting. We are selling the absolute genesis of a legend. The piece hidden beneath this drape is the very first canvas Axiom ever completed. It is the raw, unfiltered origin story of the greatest anonymous artist of our generation. The room erupted in a flurry of hushed, frantic whispers. The venture capitalists leaned forward in their velvet chairs. The international art collectors gripped their numbered bidding paddles with white-knuckled intensity. Donovan shifted his weight, his eyes locked onto the black drape with a ravenous, desperate hunger. He believed he was about to purchase a pristine, abstract masterpiece that would launder his reputation and appease the ruthless investor waiting in the mezzanine. He believed his salvation was hiding right under that velvet cloth. He had absolutely no idea he was looking directly at the ghost of his own unforgivable cruelty. I tapped my earpiece, sending the final command to my production team. Proceed with the unveiling. The auctioneer gave a subtle nod to the handlers. In perfect synchronized motion, they gripped the bottom corners of the heavy black drape and pulled it swiftly up and away from the easel. The velvet pooled on the polished floor, exposing the masterpiece to the blinding spotlight. The entire exhibition hall gasped in unison. A collective visceral shockwave rippled through the elite crowd as they absorbed the raw, violent emotion radiating from the canvas. It was the exact finger painting my 6-year-old son had created 9 years ago. The vivid, mathematically perfect geometric fractals of cerulean blue and fiery orange exploded across the surface, conveying a frantic, trapped energy-seeking order. But what made the piece absolutely devastating was the undeniable damage. The restoration team had meticulously preserved the thick, greasy black soot marks smeared across the outer edges of the canvas. The deep, violent scratches from the shattered glass of the original frame were still perfectly visible, cutting ruthlessly through the thick acrylic paint. The artwork had been violently destroyed, cast into the filthy ashes of a cold fireplace, and resurrected as a breathtaking testament to survival. It was housed in a stark, heavy iron frame that highlighted the sheer brutality of its history. Mounted directly beneath the canvas, illuminated by a secondary, highly focused beam of light, was a pristine silver plaque. The auctioneer read the engraved text aloud, his voice trembling slightly with genuine emotion. The title of this piece is The Discarded. The artist is Leo, age 6. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. The billionaires and harsh art critics stared at the canvas, mesmerized by the jarring juxtaposition of flawless genius and undeniable abuse. The painting did not just show raw talent. It told a deeply disturbing story of a brilliant, vulnerable child who had been thrown away like literal garbage. The narrative power of the piece was intoxicating. It was exactly what the elite art market craved. The auctioneer brought his wooden gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack, shattering the heavy silence. "We will open the bidding at $2 million, he announced. The response was immediate and violently aggressive. 5 different numbered paddles shot into the air simultaneously. 2.5 million, shouted a ruthless hedge fund manager from the third row. 3 million, countered a wealthy European art dealer standing near the back wall. The bidding war erupted into absolute chaos. The numbers climbed with terrifying, dizzying speed, jumping in massive increments of $500,000. The wealthy collectors were not just bidding on a piece of canvas anymore. They were fiercely fighting for the absolute prestige of owning the tragic, beautiful origin story of the most elusive artist on the planet. 3.5 million, 4 million, 4.5 million. The air in the gallery crackled with raw, unadulterated financial adrenaline. I watched my father intently from my position near the entrance. Donovan was gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were completely bone white. He was staring at the stage, his arrogant mind struggling to process the impossible astronomical numbers being shouted indiscriminately around him. He had come here fully prepared to spend $10 million of borrowed desperate money just to save his failing company. He raised his paddle, his hand shaking slightly with the adrenaline. $5 million! Donovan shouted, his voice cracking with the immense strain of his impending catastrophic bankruptcy. The entire room momentarily turned to look at the aggressive real estate developer trying to assert his dominance. But the international collectors were utterly unfazed by his aggression. 6 million, a voice called out calmly from the shadowy back corner. Donovan gritted his teeth, cold sweat beading on his forehead. He thrust his paddle into the air again. 6.5. The auctioneer pointed his heavy gavel toward the front row. 6.5 million to the gentleman in the center aisle. Do I hear 7? An elite art broker representing an anonymous overseas buyer raised a discreet hand. $7 million. Donovan was actively hyperventilating. He was watching his last desperate lifeline slip away into the hands of a stranger. Joanne was clutching his arm, her glittering emerald gown catching the ambient lights, completely unaware that she was witnessing the absolute final moments of her lavish, privileged lifestyle. Cameron looked like he was going to be physically sick right there in his expensive suit. Donovan thrust his paddle up one last time, screaming the number with absolute, blind desperation. 7.25 million. The auctioneer turned his sharp gaze to the crowd. $7,250,000. The room fell entirely silent. The European dealers lowered their paddles. The hedge fund managers shook their heads, conceding defeat. The frantic, explosive bidding war had finally reached its absolute staggering ceiling. $7,250,000 going once. The heavy wooden gavel hovered high in the air, ready to strike the podium and seal the devastating financial fate of my father forever. $7,250,000 going twice. The voice of the auctioneer rang out across the silent gallery. The heavy wooden gavel began its downward descent. In the center aisle, Donovan sat completely paralyzed. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw breath. His eyes were locked onto the massive canvas illuminated by the harsh spotlight. He was not looking at the brilliant geometric fractals or the staggering price tag flashing on the digital display board above the stage. He was staring with absolute horror at the thick, greasy black soot smeared across the edges of the canvas. He recognized those ash marks. He remembered the exact trajectory of the wooden frame as it shattered against the iron grate of his own fireplace 9 years ago. He remembered the blood on the hands of his daughter as she pulled it from the dirt. The plaque mounted below the canvas burned into his vision. The discarded. Artist Leo, age 6. The pieces of the impossible puzzle slammed together in his mind with the force of a freight train. Axiom was not a mysterious, sophisticated international art prodigy. Axiom was his grandson. Axiom was the nonverbal autistic child he had legally labeled as defective and thrown into the freezing night. The child whose artwork he had literally discarded as cheap, embarrassing trash was the genius commanding the attention of the wealthiest billionaires on the planet. Donovan felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. His mind raced frantically, colliding with the catastrophic reality of his financial ruin. He was exactly 4 days away from defaulting on a massive $8 million loan to Harrison. His real estate empire was bleeding out from the federal audit. He had come to this gala fully prepared to bankrupt himself further, just to buy an abstract painting to appease a ruthless investor. And now he realized that the $7 million lifeline he desperately needed was sitting right in front of him. It was not a piece of art he had to buy. In his twisted, arrogant, desperate mind, it was a piece of art he already owned. The greed hit him like a physical shockwave. It completely eradicated his logic, his memory of the legal severance document, and his basic grip on reality. Donovan did not see a masterpiece created by a neurodivergent genius. He only saw $7,250,000 in pure liquid cash. He saw the exact amount of money he needed to pay off his predatory debt, save Vanguard properties, and salvage his luxurious lifestyle. He turned to Cameron, grabbing the sleeve of his expensive suit with a crushing grip. Cameron winced, pulling back in confusion. "Look at the canvas!" Donovan hissed, his voice trembling with manic, desperate energy. "Look at the soot on the edges. Look at the artist's name on the plaque. Do you recognize it?" Cameron frowned, squinting through the ambient light toward the stage. His brow furrowed in confusion before his eyes widened in absolute shock. "Wait," Cameron whispered, the color draining from his face. "Is that the garbage painting Whitney brought to your birthday party? The one you threw in the fireplace?" "It is not garbage." Donovan spat, his eyes wild and ravenous. "It is an asset. It is a $7 million asset, and it was handed directly to me as a birthday gift 9 years ago. That means it is my personal property. That money belongs to Vanguard Properties." Joanne leaned over, her emerald gown rustling as she grasped the arm of my father. "Donovan, what are you talking about? Sit down. People are staring at us." Donovan ignored her completely. The auctioneer was raising the gavel for the third and final time. The sale was about to be officially closed. The money was about to be transferred into the anonymous corporate trust of Axiom. Donovan could not let that happen. He could not sit in a velvet chair and watch his financial salvation slip away into the hands of the daughter he despised. The sheer blinding arrogance that had fueled his entire corporate career completely overrode his common sense. He believed that because he was Donovan Vance, the world would simply bend to his version of the truth. He believed he could just walk up and take whatever he wanted. Donovan shot up from his chair. The sudden violent movement drew the attention of the billionaires and art brokers seated in the front rows. Cameron hesitated for only a fraction of a second before jumping up to follow him, emboldened by the prospect of securing millions of dollars to save his own failing career. I watched from the shadows near the grand entrance, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I had anticipated his greed, but seeing the pure, unadulterated madness in his eyes as he charged down the center aisle was staggering. He was walking directly into the center of the trap, entirely blind to the jaws waiting to snap shut. Security contractors moved instantly to intercept them, stepping into the aisle with their hands raised. "Sir, you must remain seated until the bidding is concluded," a massive guard instructed, placing a firm hand on the chest of my father. Donovan shoved the hand of the guard away with explosive aggression. "Get your hands off me!" he roared, his voice echoing through the silent, cavernous exhibition hall. "I am the CEO of Vanguard Properties, and I have urgent legal business on that stage." The sheer volume and hostility of his outburst paralyzed the security team for just a crucial second. They were used to discreet, polite billionaires, not desperate, shouting real estate developers. In that momentary hesitation, Donovan shoved past the guards and marched aggressively up the wooden stairs of the mahogany stage. Cameron scrambled up right behind him, trying to look imposing, but mostly looking terrified. The auctioneer froze, his wooden gavel hovering uselessly in the air. He stared at the two men invading his stage in absolute bewilderment. The international collectors sitting in the audience began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Flashbulbs from the press section at the back of the room began to strobe aggressively, capturing every second of the unprecedented disruption. High up in the private tinted glass mezzanine, Harrison watched the chaos unfold, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. Donovan marched directly to the auction podium. He did not ask for permission. He reached out and violently snatched the heavy silver microphone right out of the hands of the stunned auctioneer. The speakers let out a sharp, piercing squeal of feedback that made several wealthy guests cover their ears in pain. "Stop the auction!" Donovan bellowed into the microphone. His voice thundered through the custom acoustic panels of the historic building, radiating with absolute, unchecked authority. The entire exhibition hall fell dead silent. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the global financial and art sectors stared at him in utter disbelief. Donovan pointed a rigid, shaking finger directly at the soot-stained canvas resting on the reinforced easel. "That artwork cannot be legally sold tonight by Spectrum Canvas or any anonymous trust," he declared, panting slightly as the adrenaline surged through his veins. "That painting was a birthday gift given directly to me by my grandson 9 years ago." The crowd gasped collectively. The press cameras flashed like a lightning storm. The revelation that the legendary anonymous Axiom was the grandson of the screaming man on stage sent a massive shockwave of scandalous gossip through the elite audience. "I am the original legal owner of this piece," Donovan continued, his voice echoing with absolute manic greed as he gripped the microphone stand. "I never authorized its sale. I never transferred ownership to any gallery. That canvas is my personal property, which means that the $7,250,000 bid belongs entirely to me and my firm." Cameron nodded vigorously beside him, trying to project a unified corporate front, completely unaware of how pathetic they both looked. They were two desperate, failing executives standing on a stage that did not belong to them, trying to steal the achievements of a disabled teenager they had thrown away. The tension on the exhibition floor was palpable, a thick, suffocating dread that settled over the crowd. Joanne remained frozen in her front row seat, her hands trembling as she clutched her expensive evening bag. She realized far too late the sheer lunacy of her husband publicly halting a multi-million-dollar auction. The elite art critics in the back rows furiously typed notes on their phones documenting the spectacular, humiliating meltdown of the Vanguard Properties CEO. Donovan, completely oblivious to the disastrous optics, took another step forward on the stage. He gestured aggressively toward the masterpiece, ensuring every single camera angle captured his claim. "I demand that the funds from this auction be immediately redirected to the Vanguard Properties corporate accounts," he shouted into the microphone, doubling down on his fatal error. "We will not allow a rogue agency to profit from stolen family assets." Cameron crossed his arms, attempting to look intimidating, but the sweat pouring down his forehead betrayed his mounting panic. He glanced nervously toward the private mezzanine, suddenly hyper-aware of the powerful financial players watching their desperate display. I remained perfectly still in the shadows by the entrance, watching the final pieces of my meticulously constructed trap lock firmly into place. The arrogance of my father had blinded him to the most basic laws of corporate finance. In his frantic rush to grab the money, he had forgotten the golden rule of debt. You never ever brag about hidden assets when a shark is circling your sinking ship. The auctioneer stepped back from the podium, clearly terrified, leaving Donovan standing entirely alone in the blinding spotlight, waiting for his stolen victory. The absolute silence in the gallery was heavy enough to crush bone. The auctioneer stepped away from the podium, his hands raised in a gesture of complete surrender, leaving my father standing entirely alone in the blinding glare of the spotlight. Donovan breathed heavily, his chest puffing with the toxic pride of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the entire financial world. He gripped the microphone, waiting for the applause, waiting for the auctioneer to confirm his brilliant, forceful acquisition. Instead, the sound of a heavy glass door sliding open sliced through the dead quiet. High above the exhibition floor, the tinted glass panels of the private mezzanine slid apart. The sharp, deliberate sound of slow clapping began to echo through the cavernous acoustic space. Every single billionaire press member and art critic tilted their head upward. Harrison stepped out onto the cantilevered balcony. He wore an immaculate, razor-sharp black suit, his posture radiating the casual, lethal dominance of an apex predator who had just cornered his prey. He leaned over the glass railing, looking down at my father, with eyes completely devoid of mercy. He reached out, and took a wireless microphone from one of his security contractors. Thank you for publicly claiming ownership of a $7.25 million asset on camera. Donovan Harrison announced, his deep, resonant voice booming through the gallery sound system. Because you defaulted on your $8 million loan this morning, my company is legally seizing all your personal and corporate assets, including this painting. The words hit the room like a localized earthquake. The collective gasp from the elite crowd sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the air. Below the mezzanine, the face of my father transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The blood drained from his cheeks so rapidly, he looked like a walking corpse. He stared up at the venture capitalist, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, the microphone slipping from his trembling, sweaty fingers and hitting the wooden stage floor with a loud, ringing thud. Harrison did not stop there. He raised his hand, signaling the perimeter of the room. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the gallery swung open with brutal force. A highly coordinated team of corporate liquidators, flanked by armed private security contractors and two uniformed federal marshals, marched directly onto the exhibition floor. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, fanning out to block every single exit. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Harrison continued smoothly, watching the security team secure the perimeter. Your commercial properties are currently being locked down by my associates in Connecticut. Your luxury vehicles, your private estate, and every single liquid asset bearing the name of Vanguard Properties now legally belongs to me to satisfy your outstanding defaulted debt. And thanks to your incredibly loud documented confession just now, this masterpiece will be added to the liquidation inventory. Panic, absolute and unfiltered, finally shattered the arrogant facade of my father. He looked wildly around the room, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of the trap he had just sprung on himself. He turned frantically to Cameron, who was standing frozen on the edge of the stage. "Do something!" Donovan hissed, grabbing the lapels of his golden child. "Call the lawyers. Tell them this is a mistake." Cameron reacted with the cowardice I always knew he possessed. He violently shoved the hands of our father away, stumbling backward down the stage stairs. He backed away into the crowd, shaking his head, his eyes wide with the realization that his trust fund, his sports car, and his entire identity had just evaporated into thin air. Joanne let out a piercing, hysterical shriek from the front row, dropping her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the polished concrete, mirroring the complete destruction of her lavish, privileged existence. Donovan was entirely alone. The walls of his empire had collapsed, leaving him exposed, bankrupt, and publicly disgraced in front of the most powerful people in New York. His wild, panicked eyes darted through the crowd of investors who were already whispering, turning their backs, and socially excommunicating him in real time. Then his desperate gaze landed on me. I stood calmly at this edge of the center aisle, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of cold satisfaction. I was no longer holding a digital clipboard. I had smoothly transitioned a sleek black designer bag onto my shoulder. The delusion of my father reached its absolute breaking point. His brain, fracturing under the weight of his financial ruin, latched onto the only familiar target in the room. He scrambled awkwardly off the mahogany stage, nearly tripping over the heavy velvet drape he had discarded moments earlier. He sprinted down the center aisle, pushing past the horrified European art dealers and elite critics. He collapsed right in front of me, his knees literally buckling as he grabbed the sleeve of my blazer. He was crying. Actual physical tears streamed down his wrinkled, panicked face. The ruthless real estate titan who had thrown me into the freezing winter night was now groveling at my feet like a pathetic broken animal. "Whitney, please." Donovan choked out his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You have to tell him. You have to tell Harrison the painting belongs to you. Tell him you painted it. Tell him you stole it from the house. Tell him it is your property so he cannot legally seize it. Please, you have to save me." I looked down at the man who had called my son defective. I looked at the man who had laughed while I dug through filthy fireplace ashes with bleeding hands. I felt absolutely nothing but a deep, profound, and icy triumph. I slowly reached into my designer bag. I did not pull out a tissue to dry his tears. I pulled out a thick, aged manila folder. I opened it with deliberate, agonizing slowness, extracting a single folded piece of paper. The heavy cream parchment was slightly yellowed at the edges, but the black ink at the bottom was still perfectly legible. It was the exact same severance of support document he had forced me to sign under duress 9 years ago in his freezing driveway. I cannot do that. Donovan, I stated clearly, pitching my voice so that the federal marshals and the silent watching crowd could hear every single syllable. Because you legally explicitly forbade me from ever claiming any association with you or your assets. I held the document up, ensuring the bright gallery lights illuminated his forceful handwritten addendum. I looked directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes, and I read aloud the exact legal clause he had engineered to destroy me. I, Donovan, claim no ownership responsibility or association with Whitney or any of her defective child's property or assets. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Donovan stared at the paper, his mouth falling open in a silent scream of realization. He recognized his own handwriting. He recognized the ruthless legal trap he had built with his own two hands, a trap that had laid dormant for nearly a decade, waiting patiently to snap his neck. This auction was legally and exclusively orchestrated by the private corporate trust of my son Leo. I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable authority. The $7,250,000 belongs solely to him. You never owned this painting, you never had any legal right to it. You abandoned it in the ashes, and you legally signed away your rights to it 9 years ago. I paused, letting the devastating reality wash completely over him. However, I continued, stepping back and gesturing toward the federal marshals, who were now moving swiftly down the aisle toward us. Your public, highly documented lie on that stage just gave Mr. Harrison the exact legal grounds he needs. You just attempted to claim ownership of a massive hidden financial asset to avoid paying a defaulted debt. That is textbook debt fraud and attempted asset concealment. The marshals reached my father. They did not gently ask him to stand. They hauled him roughly to his feet by his expensive suit jacket. Donovan thrashed weakly, his eyes darting frantically between me, the marshals, and the gallery doors. He tried to speak, tried to formulate another lie, another excuse, another way out, but his voice completely failed him. The cold, heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed sharply through the silent exhibition hall. Cameron and Joanne stood completely paralyzed in the front row, watching in absolute, unadulterated horror as the patriarch of their toxic empire was marched down the center aisle like a common criminal. They were entirely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their future. They were left bankrupt, facing federal scrutiny and publicly humiliated in front of the entire international elite. They were finally experiencing the exact same cold, isolated terror they had forced upon me all those years ago. I did not stay to watch them cry. I turned my back on the wreckage of my former family and walked smoothly out the grand front doors of the gallery. The cool, crisp night air of Manhattan hit my face, smelling of freedom and absolute victory. I signaled my private security team waiting by the curb. The door to a sleek, armored luxury SUV swung open. Sitting inside, completely insulated from the noise and the flashing cameras, was my brilliant 15-year-old son. Leo was wearing his favorite noise-canceling headphones, calmly tracing a complex geometric pattern onto a digital drawing tablet. He looked up as I climbed inside, offering me a small, beautiful, entirely genuine smile. "We did it," I whispered softly, pulling him into a tight, fierce embrace. The heavy door of the SUV closed, shutting out the chaos of the art world and the destruction of the Vance family forever. The engine purred smoothly as we pulled away from the curb, merging into the bright, flowing traffic of the city. We were completely free, we were victorious, and we were impossibly, undeniably wealthy. We were driving toward a future built entirely on our own terms, leaving the ashes of the past permanently behind us.